simply learned how to listen.
Pirate First's pipe dream, the Cenote Chronicles, begins.
Pipe Dream Part 9. The Sovereign Principality. MXTM aka Pirate 1 or VJ Tsunami X. July 19, 2026. Chapter 1, The Legal Gap. Law is a surface phenomenon. The surface world's legal systems were developed by civilizations that organized themselves on land, civilizations whose fundamental legal categories, whose property frameworks, whose jurisdictional architectures, whose governance institutions were all calibrated to the specific ontology of terrestrial existence, the fixed location, the defined boundary, the surveyed parcel, the registered address, the municipal district, the national territory whose borders the treaty map describes and whose interior the state's sovereignty uniformly fills. The surface world's legal system has been extended, with varying success and at significant institutional effort, to the ocean's surface, to the airspace above the land, to the subsurface mineral rights beneath the land, and to the orbital shells above the atmosphere. Each extension required the development of new legal categories that the terrestrial tradition's ontology did not natively provide: the exclusive economic zone for the ocean's resource management, the airspace sovereignty doctrine for the aviation corridor's jurisdictional organization, the mineral rights conveyance for the subsurface economic value allocation, the orbital debris liability regime for the near-Earth space's governance challenge. Each extension was contested, incomplete, and subject to the governance failures that the extension's conceptual inadequacy produces: the high seas fisheries commons tragedy, the airspace sovereignty's conflicts with satellite overflight, the subsurface mineral rights conflicts with surface property rights when the extraction surface expression exceeds the mineral rights license terms, and the orbital debris liability regime's failure to prevent the cascading Kessler syndrome that the unmanaged accumulation of orbital debris is producing. The surface world's legal system has not been extended to the cenote's three-dimensional freshwater zone, the geological void 50 to 100 meters below the jungle canopy, accessed through the limestone formation's dissolution openings, containing the inhabited crystal tube network and the biological communities that the civilization's ecological management maintains. The cenote is not a surveyed parcel. The cenote's three-dimensional interior is not a defined property boundary. The habitation that the founding module has established within the cenote's freshwater zone does not correspond to any property category in the host state's legal framework, because no legal framework has developed the category for a structure floating at a specific depth in a geological void accessed through a natural opening in the Earth's surface. The legal gap is not an oversight. It is the structural consequence of the surface world's legal system's calibration to the terrestrial ontology. A civilization that inhabits a three-dimensional geological formation below the surface world's legal system's operational domain has not been anticipated by the legal categories that the surface world's legal tradition developed for the surface world's territorial organization. The legal gap is the principality's founding legal condition. The principality does not exist despite the legal gap. The principality exists because of it. The surface world's property taxonomy. The surface world's property taxonomy organizes the real property relationship into the categories that the terrestrial ontology requires: the land parcel, defined by the horizontal coordinates of its boundary at the Earth's surface; the building, defined by the vertical extent of its constructed enclosure above the parcel's surface; the subsurface mineral right, defined by the depth range and the resource type that the conveyance specifies below the parcel's surface; and the airspace right, defined by the altitude range above the parcel's surface that the jurisdictional authority and the navigation servitude's airspace reservation leave available for the surface owner's exclusive use. The taxonomy's defining characteristic is the primacy of the surface. The surface parcel is the foundational legal unit from which every other property right derives its existence. The building's legal existence derives from the surface parcel's ownership or leasehold. The subsurface mineral rights existence derives from the surface parcel's conveyance or the mining claims registration. The airspace rights existence derives from the surface parcel's ownership and the jurisdictional authority's air navigation regulations that define the usable altitude above it. The surface is the legal system's ground truth. The cenote installation's physical reality does not fit the surface taxonomy's categories at any level of the taxonomy's applicability analysis. The cenote's three-dimensional freshwater zone is below the surface parcel's horizontal extent at the surface. It is accessed through the cenote opening that the surface parcel's boundary encompasses, but the freshwater zone's physical extent at depth does not correspond to the surface parcel's horizontal extent, because the dissolution geology's passage network connects the cenote's freshwater zone to the regional aquifer system that extends beneath multiple surface parcels, multiple municipal jurisdictions, and potentially multiple sovereign territories. The founding module's crystal tube installation at the cenote's freshwater zone is physically located below the surface parcel's boundary, in the subsurface that the surface owner's subsurface rights would conventionally cover. But the subsurface rights in the host state's legal framework apply to the mineral resources that the subsurface contains, not to the void space that the dissolution geology has produced. The cenote's freshwater zone is void space, empty of mineral resource in the conventional sense, and the host state's subsurface rights framework does not provide a legal category for the ownership or the habitation of void space below the surface parcel's boundary. The crystal tube installation is floating in the void. The void is below the surface. The surface's legal system has no framework for the floating installation's property status in the void that the surface's legal categories have not categorized. The floating installation is in the legal gap. The float is founding act. The founding engineer's decision not to anchor the founding module to the cenote's limestone walls during the trial window was documented in Part 1 as the aquaforming doctrine's physical expression. The cenote decides whether to accept the installation, not the installation's anchor commitment. The trial window is the installation's observational period, and the anchor commitment is the trial's conclusion. The founding module becomes a fixed structure only when the formation has communicated the readiness that the terraform operator's concurrent authorization confirms. The float has a legal dimension that the parties' physical documentation did not address. The floating structure's legal status in the surface world's property taxonomy is different from the anchored structure's legal status, and the difference is the founding act's most important legal consequence. An anchored structure in the cenote's freshwater zone would be analyzed under the host state's legal framework as a subsurface improvement to real property, the structure physically attached to the limestone that the surface parcel owner's subsurface rights extend to, whose legal status is the real property improvement that the construction permits authorization and the building code's compliance verification would establish in the host state's legal framework. The anchored structure's legal status is the host state's legal system's jurisdiction, because the host state's legal system's jurisdiction extends to subsurface improvements on the surface parcels within the host state's territory. A floating structure in the cenote's freshwater zone is not attached to the limestone. Before the anchor commitment, the founding module is a floating structure in a geological void, a body of water within the host state's territory, but not a real property improvement in the real property law sense. The floating structure in a body of water has the legal status that the surface world's maritime law provides for floating structures in bodies of water: the vessel, the barge, the floating platform, each of which has the registration and documentation requirements that the maritime authority's framework specifies, rather than the construction permit and building code's compliance that the real property law requires. The founding module's legal status during the trial window is the maritime law's floating structure, not the real property law's subsurface improvement. The maritime law's floating structure's registration places the founding module in the host state's vessel registry rather than in the host state's land registry, a different legal category with a different ownership framework, a different taxation regime, and a different jurisdictional relationship to the host state's governance authority. The maritime law's floating structure is the legal gap's entry point. The vessel is the surface world's legal system's category for a structure that inhabits water without being real property, and the founding module in the cenote's freshwater zone is a structure that inhabits water without being real property. The vessel registration is not a perfect fit. The maritime law's vessel framework was developed for ocean navigation and coastal waterway transport, and the founding module does not navigate, but it is the legal category that the surface world's legal system provides for the floating structure in water. And the Principality's founding legal strategy uses the vessel registration as the legal category for the founding module's initial documentation. The vessel registration is the legal gap's first documentation. The founding module registered as a vessel in the host state's maritime authority's framework, with the documentation that the maritime law requires for a floating structure in inland waters, at the address that the cenote opening's GPS coordinates provide as the vessel's documented home port. The legal gap is not closed by the vessel registration. The vessel registration is the documentation of the founding module's presence in the gap, the acknowledgement that the founding module exists as a floating structure in the cenote's freshwater zone, documented in the legal category that most closely approximates the founding module's physical reality, with the explicit acknowledgement that the approximation is not exact. The habitation record. The habitation record is the Principality's legal innovation, the founding charter's mechanism for converting the founding module's vessel registration from an approximation of the legal reality to the documentation of a specific legal status that the founding charter asserts, and the Principality deals negotiation seeks to establish, as the basis for the Principality's recognition as a distinct jurisdictional entity within the host state's legal framework. The habitation record is the continuous documentation of the cenote installation's permanent human habitation, the coordinating system's record of the individuals who have resided in the installation beyond the threshold duration that the founding charter specifies as the residency period that establishes the habitation claim, the biological monitoring's record of the installation's atmospheric management's continuous maintenance of the conditions that the permanent habitation requires, and the governance record's documentation of the Redeemer framework's deliberative processes that the permanent resident population has conducted in the installation's political decision-making. The habitation record's legal significance is the assertion that the founding charter makes from it, the cenote installation's continuous permanent habitation, documented at the resolution and the continuity that the coordinating system's monitoring provides, establishes the habitation claim that is the international law's basis for the populated territory's recognition as a political entity with the governance rights that territorial sovereignty implies. The assertion is legally ambitious. The international law's recognition of territorial sovereignty is organized around the terrestrial states' conventions, the land territories' defined boundaries, the permanent population, the effective government, and the capacity to enter into relations with other states, as the Montevideo Convention's criteria specify. The cenote installation meets 3 of the 4 criteria: a permanent population, an effective government in the Redeemer framework's governance architecture, and the capacity to enter into relations with other states through the Principality deal's negotiating history. The defined boundaries criterion is the challenge. The cenote's freshwater zone is a geological void whose 3-dimensional extent is defined by the dissolution geology rather than by any surveyed boundary that the Territorial Sovereignty Convention's boundary definition requires. The Founding Charter's response to the boundary challenge is the 3-dimensional habitation record, the documentation of the inhabited volume's physical extent as the coordinating system's crystal tube network's installed infrastructure defines it, the crystal tube sections, the gallery rings, the hub volumes, the floating village platforms, and the anchored tower sections together constitute the installed volume that the permanent habitation occupies, and the habitation record's 3-dimensional coordinate record documents this volume's physical extent at the spatial resolution that the coordinating system's GPS analog acoustic positioning provides. The 3-dimensional habitation record is the Principality's claim to a new legal category, the inhabited geological formations territory, defined by the 3-dimensional coordinates of the permanent habitation's installed extent rather than by the surface boundary that the Terrestrial Sovereignty Convention requires. The claim is novel. The legal precedent is absent. The international law's development of the inhabited geological formations territorial status is the work that the Principality deal's negotiation has begun and that the Principality's governance records accumulation across the design life will progressively build the legal basis for. The Principality deal. The Principality deal is the negotiated recognition framework that establishes the legal basis for the cenote installation's operation within the host state's jurisdiction, not the full sovereign recognition that the Montevideo Convention's criteria support as an aspiration and that the Principality's habitation record's long-term accumulation is building toward, but the pragmatic operational recognition that allows the installation to function, to receive guests through the tourism program, to enroll participants in the longevity program, to conduct the research commons scientific program, and to govern the permanent resident population through the Redeemer framework, within the legal framework that the host state's authority over its territory requires. The Principality deal's negotiating history is the Founding Charter's most diplomatically sensitive documentation. The specific terms that the host state accepted as the recognition framework for the cenote installation's operation are the product of the negotiating process that the founding generation conducted with the host state's relevant ministries across the founding period's first years, and the term's specific content reflects the negotiating parties' mutual assessment of the legal GAP's implications, the installation's economic value to the host state's tourism revenue and research investment, and the strategic considerations that the Founding Charter's strategic duplicity principle specifies as the negotiating posture's governing philosophy. The negotiating posture's governing philosophy is documented in Chapter 5 of this part rather than here, because the strategic duplicity principle's full treatment requires the context that the Principality deal's terms documentation provides. The terms themselves, the specific legal provisions that the Principality deal establishes for the installation's operational recognition, are the Founding Charter's governance framework's legal foundation, and their documentation here is the foundation for every subsequent governance chapter's operational context. The Principality deal's recognition framework establishes the installation's right to operate the tourism and longevity program under the host state's regulatory framework for medical tourism and adventure tourism facilities, with the certification and compliance requirements that the host state's tourism regulatory authority specifies. The installation's right to conduct the research commons scientific program under the host state's research institution framework, with the research ethics review and the publication standards that the academic regulatory authority applies to research institutions operating within the host state's territory. The installation's right to maintain the permanent resident population under the host state's residential visa framework, with the documentation requirements and the renewable terms that the immigration authority's framework specifies for extended residential status within the host state. And the installation's right to conduct the Redeemer governance framework's deliberative processes as the internal governance of the permanent resident community, with the host state's acknowledgement that the internal governance does not supersede the host state's legal jurisdiction but that the host state will not exercise its jurisdiction over the installation's internal governance decisions except in the specific categories that the Principality deal explicitly reserves for the host state's authority. The reserved categories are the Principality deal's most carefully negotiated provisions, the specific governance domains, criminal law, environmental regulation, immigration authority, that the host state retains jurisdiction over within the cenote installation's inhabited zones, defined with sufficient specificity to give the host state the legal authority that its sovereignty requires over these categories and with sufficient limitation to allow the Redeemer framework's governance to operate as the installation's primary governance institution for the categories that the reserved jurisdiction does not encompass. The reserved categories' boundaries are where the strategic duplicity principle operates most precisely. The principality's internal governance extends to the boundary of the reserved categories' definition, and the strategic duplicity maintains the outward alignment with the host state's reserved jurisdiction at the boundary, while the internal governance's practical application extends to the fullest interpretation of the internal governance's scope that the reserved categories' definition allows. The legal gap's productive function. The legal gap is not a vulnerability that the principality seeks to close. It is the productive condition that the principality's legal strategy exploits. The surface world's legal system's failure to have developed a category for the inhabited geological formations territory is the condition that allows the principality's founding charter to assert the novel category's existence and to build the legal precedent that the novel category requires through the habitation records accumulation and the principality deals recognition framework's progressive expansion. The legal gap's productive function is temporal. The time that the legal system's underdevelopment of the inhabited geological formation's legal status provides is the time during which the principality's habitation record accumulates the evidence for the novel category's legal basis. The Redeemer governance framework's deliberative culture matures into the effective government that the Montevideo Convention's criteria require, and the principality deals recognition framework expands progressively toward the full sovereignty recognition that the founding charter's long-term legal strategy aspires to. The time is the principality's strategic resource. The legal gap is the time's generator. The surface world's legal system's failure to develop the inhabited geological formations legal category is the principality's most valuable legal asset, the condition that the principality exploits by being inside it before the legal system develops the category that would define the exploitation's terms. The analogy is the invention's patent. The patent is valuable because the invention is novel and the legal system has not yet developed the framework for the invention's widespread application. The principality is building the legal patent for the inhabited geological formation's territorial status, asserting the novel category's existence through the habitation records accumulation, the principality deals recognition framework's negotiation, and the governance records documentation of the effective government's operation, before the international legal system develops the framework that would define the category's terms independently of the principality's contribution to the development. The principality wants to be the precedent. The precedent is the legal gap's productive output, the novel legal category that the first inhabited geological formation establishes through the accumulated evidence of its permanent habitation, its effective governance, and its recognition by the host state's framework. The precedent is the legal asset that subsequent inhabited geological formations, the living pantry replications installations, the ocean colonies' Anchialan systems, the comparable geological formations in other sovereign territories, will inherit as the legal basis for their own recognition framework's negotiation. The first principality establishes the category. The subsequent installations inherit the category. The category is the legal gap's closure, not the gap's elimination, but its conversion from the uncharted legal territory that the surface world's legal system has not entered into the novel legal category that the first principality's habitation record, governance record, and recognition framework have documented as the inhabited geological formation's legal basis. The legal gap, closed, is the principality's legal legacy. The legal gap, open, is the principality's current strategic condition. The gap's closure requires the time that the habitation records accumulation and the principality deals progressive expansion together produce. Pipe dream is inside the gap. Building the evidence. Accumulating the record. Expanding the recognition. Establishing the precedent. The legal gap is not a problem to be solved. It is a territory to be settled. The host state's perspective. The principality's legal strategy is not conducted in the host state's ignorance. The host state's relevant ministries, the Tourism Authority, the Environmental Regulatory Body, the Immigration Authority, and the Legal Council whose assessment of the cenote installation's legal status the principality deals negotiation required, are aware that the cenote installation's legal status is novel, that the principality deals recognition framework is an improvisation within the existing legal categories rather than a perfect fit for the installation's legal reality, and that the principality's long-term aspiration is the legal recognition that the habitation records accumulation and the governance records documentation are building toward. The host state's perspective on the principality's legal strategy is not uniform. Some ministries see the cenote installation's legal novelty as a regulatory challenge that the existing framework's extension to the novel category would resolve. Others see it as a legal vacuum that the principality's internal governance is filling in ways that the host state's sovereignty over its territory should govern. And others see it as an economic asset whose tourism and research contributions to the host state's economy justify the principality deals recognition framework's pragmatic accommodation of the legal novelty. The host state's perspective's heterogeneity is the principality deals negotiating environment. The ministries whose perspective supports the principality deals recognition framework's expansion are the negotiating partners whose institutional interests the principality's legal strategy cultivates. The ministries whose perspective challenges the recognition framework's terms are the negotiating counterparts whose institutional concerns the strategic duplicity principle's outward alignment addresses. The strategic duplicity is not deception of the host state about the principality's existence, character, or long-term aspirations. The host state's ministries know what the principality is and what the principality deal's terms are. The strategic duplicity is the principality's management of the presentation, what the principality emphasizes in its outward-facing communications with the host state's various institutional actors, what it acknowledges when challenged, and what it allows to remain in the legal gap's productive ambiguity without volunteering the clarification that would require the host state's regulatory framework to address the novel category's governance before the principality's habitation record has accumulated the evidence that the novel category's assertion requires. The productive ambiguity is the gap's most delicate management. The point at which the legal gap's ambiguity becomes a governance challenge that the host state's regulatory framework cannot sustain without the clarification that would constrain the principality's legal strategy is the point at which the strategic duplicity's outward alignment must offer enough of the clarification to sustain the host state's accommodation without offering so much clarification that the accommodation's pragmatic basis is foreclosed by the definitional commitment the clarification would impose. The principality's legal counsel, the international law specialists whose institutional relationship the founding charter specifies as a permanent governance function of the Redeemer Framework's legal committee, maintains the real-time assessment of the productive ambiguity's current position, how much ambiguity the host state's current institutional context sustains, how much clarification the host state's current regulatory pressure requires, and when the principality deals recognition. Framework's progressive expansion can advance the recognition without triggering the definitional commitment that would constrain the long-term legal strategy. The legal counsel's assessment is the governance record's most sensitive content, the Redeemer Framework's classified archive, the governance records section whose access the legal committee's authorization protocols restrict to the permanent residents whose governance role requires the strategic information's access, maintains the legal strategy's current state and the productive ambiguity's current management assessment. The classified archive is not secret in the corruption sense, its existence is documented in the founding charter's transparency framework, and the archive's classification is subject to the Redeemer Framework's declassification protocol schedule. It is classified in the strategic sense. The legal strategy's effectiveness depends on the host state's various institutional actors not having simultaneous access to the principality's complete assessment of the productive ambiguity's management, because the simultaneous access would produce the coordinated institutional response that the legal strategy's sequential management of the individual institutional actors' perspectives is designed to prevent. The acoustic boundary. The legal gap's most specific expression is the acoustic boundary, the physical phenomenon that the cenote's geological formation produces as the boundary between the principality's inhabited interior and the host state's surface world jurisdiction, expressed not as a surveyed property line but as the physics of the limestone and water that separates the crystal tube network's inhabited atmospheric volume from the surface world's atmospheric and legal jurisdiction. The acoustic boundary is documented in the founding charter's sovereignty provisions as the distributed sanctuary concept, the cenote's limestone and water columns acoustic physics, which Part 2's Chapter 2 established as the communication security architecture's foundation, is simultaneously the sovereignty's physical expression, the boundary that the surface world's legal system cannot penetrate without the physical access that the cenote opening's geological geometry constrains. The acoustic boundary's sovereignty function is the physical complement to the legal gap's legal function. The legal gap means that the surface world's legal system has not established the jurisdictional framework for the cenote installation's governance. The acoustic boundary means that the surface world's enforcement mechanism, the physical access that the legal system's authority requires to exercise jurisdiction, is constrained by the cenote's geological geometry to the access points that the principality controls through the crystal tube network's wetlock docking protocol. The wetlock docking protocol is the principality's border control, the physical point at which the surface world's atmosphere becomes the crystal tube network's atmospheric enclosure, where the pressure equalization sequence is the transition between the two atmospheric domains, and where the principality's governance authority over the transition is the access management protocol's operational expression. The access management protocol is not a border control system in the surface world sense. It is not the passport inspection and customs declaration that the surface world's territorial border crossing requires. It is the safety protocol that the pressure equalization sequence requires for the diver's physiological safety and the atmospheric management system's integrity. The safety function is genuine. The governance function is the safety protocol's consequence. The principality controls access to its inhabited interior through the same protocol that the physics of living inside a pressurized underground formation requires. The acoustic boundary and the access management protocol together constitute the distributed sanctuary's physical expression, the sovereignty that is distributed across the formation's geological physics rather than concentrated at a defined territorial boundary that the surface world's legal system can address with the territorial sovereignty's enforcement mechanisms. The distributed sanctuary is sovereign not because the international law has recognized it as sovereign. The principality deal's recognition framework is still the pragmatic accommodation rather than the full sovereignty recognition. but because the formation's physics enforces the access constraints that the sovereignty requires. The formation is the border. The limestone is the wall. The halocline is the moat. The wetlock is the gate. The gate is controlled by the principality. The wall is controlled by geology. The sovereignty is distributed between the two. What the legal gap requires. The legal gap's productive function requires the principality's continuous maintenance of three simultaneous conditions: the habitation record's uninterrupted documentation, the governance record's effective governance demonstration, and the principality deal's progressive recognition framework expansion. The habitation record's interruption, a period during which the installation's permanent resident population falls below the threshold duration requirement that the founding charter specifies as the habitation claim's evidentiary minimum, is the legal strategy's most consequential vulnerability. The surface world's legal system's recognition of the inhabited geological formation's novel legal category depends on the continuous permanent habitation that the habitation record documents. An interrupted habitation record is an interrupted legal claim. The interruption's duration determines whether the claim survives as a legal basis for the recognition framework's continuation or must be rebuilt from a new habitation record's initiation. The evacuation protocol's trigger condition, the formation events that exceed the design envelope and require the installation's full evacuation, is therefore the legal strategy's most consequential safety architecture intersection. The evacuation that the safety architecture's correct design would execute for the permanent resident population's physical safety is simultaneously the habitation record's interruption that the legal strategy's continuation requires to be as short as possible. The founding charter's evacuation protocol specifies the minimum occupancy requirement that the habitation record's continuity demands. The permanent resident population must return to the installation within the interruption period that the founding charter's legal strategy assessment identifies as the maximum duration that the habitation record's continuity survives as a legal claim. If the evacuation's duration exceeds this maximum, the habitation record's continuity claim is rebuilt from the return date rather than maintained from the installation's founding date. The continuity's loss does not invalidate the governance record's effective governance demonstration or the principality deal's recognition framework's established terms. It reduces the habitation record's evidentiary weight for the novel legal category's full sovereignty claim by resetting the continuous habitation duration from the founding date to the return date. The legal strategy's assessment of the maximum interruption period balances the physical safety requirement against the legal continuity requirement, and the evacuation protocol's return timing is the balance's operational expression. The legal gap requires the civilization to be continuously inside it. Continuously inhabiting. Continuously governing. Continuously building the record that the novel category's legal basis requires. The civilization is inside the gap. The civilization is staying inside the gap. The gap is closing around the civilization's continuous presence. The novel legal category is being created by the civilization's continued existence inside the space that the surface world's legal system has not yet categorized. This is the legal gap's most fundamental truth: the law will follow the civilization that establishes the fact on the ground. The fact on the ground is the permanent habitation. The permanent habitation is what the civilization is building, maintaining, governing, and recording in the Digital Twins Commons governance archive. The law will catch up. The civilization will already be there. Cross-references, Part 2, CH2, Engineering Invisible Architecture, Part 7, CH3, Compartmentalized Cities, Part 8, Section A, CH4, From Resort to Municipality, Part 9, CH2, Floating Title and the Habitation Record, Part 9, CH3, Strategic Duplicity, Part 9, CH4, Redeemer's Governance OS, Part 9, CH5, The Commons Ownership Principle, Part 9, CH6, Distributed Sanctuary. For Principality Deal Recognition Framework Terms and Classified Archive Access Protocol, see Appendix H, Governance Operations Manual. For Habitation Record Documentation Protocol and Continuity Threshold Specification, see Appendix H, Governance Operations Manual. For Evacuation Protocol Return Timing and Habitation Record Interruption Maximum Duration Assessment, see Appendix H, Governance Operations Manual. For Wetlock Access Management Protocol and Border Control Governance Function Documentation, see Appendix D, Construction Operations Manual, and Appendix H, Governance Operations Manual. For three-dimensional habitation record coordinate documentation standard and GPS analog acoustic positioning integration, see Appendix G, Formation Intelligence Record. Pipe Dream. Part 9, The Sovereign Principality. Chapter 2, Floating Title and the Habitation Record. Title is the surface world's fundamental legal instrument. Not the document, the concept, the bundle of rights that the legal system recognizes as inhering in a person's relationship to a specific piece of property, constituted by the combination of ownership, use, exclusion, transfer, and inheritance that the property law's taxonomy has developed across the several millennia of agricultural civilization's legal tradition. The title is not the land. The title is the legally recognized claim to the land's specific bundle of rights, registered in the registry that the state's legal authority maintains as the authoritative record of who holds which bundle of rights to which piece of property. The title is always registered somewhere, against something. The registration somewhere is the land registry, the state-maintained record whose entry creates the legal fact of the property relationship. The registration something is the cadastral parcel, the surveyed unit of land whose physical description the registry entry references as the spatial definition of the property relationship's object. Without the registry entry, the title does not legally exist. Without the cadastral parcel, the registry entry has no spatial reference. Without the spatial reference, the property relationship is unregistered, legally uncertain, and practically unenforceable. The cenote installation has no cadastral parcel. The freshwater zone's three-dimensional geological void is not a surveyed unit of land. The host state's land registry does not contain an entry for the habitable geological formation at the coordinates the cenote opening's GPS position specifies, because the land registry's cadastral taxonomy does not include a parcel type for three-dimensional geological voids that a civilization inhabits below the surface world's surveyed plane. The cenote installation therefore has no title in the surface world's conventional sense. It has no registered ownership, no cadastral reference, no land registry entry. The founding module floats in the freshwater zone, the anchor pylons connect the crystal tube network to the limestone, the biological community is managed across the formation's ecological zones, the permanent resident population conducts its governance under the Redeemer framework, and none of this produces a title in the surface world's legal framework, because none of it corresponds to the cadastral parcel, the registry entry, or the registered bundle of rights that the title requires. What the cenote installation has instead is the floating title, the novel legal instrument that the founding charter creates as the property relationships documentation for an inhabited geological formation that the surface world's cadastral taxonomy has not categorized. What floating title is? The floating title is not a title in the surface world's legal sense. It is the founding charter's assertion that a new category of property relationship requires a new category of legal documentation, and that the documentation's creation is the principality's legal contribution to the development of the legal category that the inhabited geological formation requires. The floating title's name is the founding charter's deliberate pun, the installation floats in the formation before the anchor commitment, and the title floats in the legal system before the recognition framework's establishment of the legal category that would give the title conventional legal effect. Both floats are the same condition, the condition of being present in a geological or legal space that has not yet developed the fixed categories that would define the presence's legal or physical status. The floating title's documentation is the habitation record's legal expression, the coordinating system's continuous documentation of the installation's physical presence in the cenote's three-dimensional geological void, converted into the legal form that the founding charter specifies as the property relationships documentation. The documentation includes the installation survey, the three-dimensional coordinate record of every crystal tube section, gallery ring, floating platform, and anchored tower in the installation's physical extent, expressed in the GPS analog acoustic positioning's coordinate reference frame and registered in the digital twin's construction layer as the installation's as-built spatial record. The installation survey is the floating title's spatial reference, the documentation of the specific three-dimensional space that the installation's physical extent defines within the cenote's geological void. The habitation documentation, the coordinating system's continuous record of the installation's permanent human occupation, expressed as the individual resident's presence record, the entry, exit, and continuous presence data that the Wetlock Access Management Protocol generates as each individual transitions between the installation's atmospheric interior and the surface world's atmosphere. The habitation documentation is the floating title's occupancy evidence, the proof that the specific three-dimensional space defined by the installation survey has been continuously occupied by the permanent resident population at the density and continuity that the founding charter's habitation threshold specifies. The governance record, the Redeemer framework's deliberative process records, the council meetings, the governance decisions, the terraform operators' authorizations, the research commons publication series, the biological monitoring's ecosystem assessment reports, that together constitute the evidence of the effective governance that the Montevideo Convention's third criterion requires for the populated territory's recognition as a political entity. The governance record is the floating title's governance evidence, the proof that the specific three-dimensional space defined by the installation survey and occupied by the habitation documentation's permanent residence is governed effectively by the Redeemer framework's constitutional architecture. The three components together, the installation survey, the habitation documentation, and the governance record, constitute the floating title's evidentiary basis, the documentation of the inhabited geological formation's existence, occupancy, and governance that the novel legal category's establishment requires as the legal precedent's factual foundation. The registry problem. The floating title's documentation exists in the founding charter's governance archive, in the digital twin's construction and monitoring layers, and in the research commons publication record. It does not exist in any state's land registry, because no state's land registry has a parcel type for the three-dimensional geological void that the floating title documents. The registry problem is the floating title's fundamental legal vulnerability. Without the authoritative registry entry that the surface world's property law requires for the title's legal effect, the floating title's documentation is the founding charter's internal record rather than the legal system's authoritative record of the property relationship. The founding charter can document whatever it chooses. The legal system's authoritative effect depends on the registry that the state's legal authority maintains. The registry problem's resolution is the Principality deal's most practically significant accomplishment, the recognition framework's establishment of an alternative registration mechanism that gives the floating title's documentation the legal effect that the conventional land registry's entry would provide if the cadastral parcel existed to reference. The alternative registration mechanism is the Principality deal's marine registry provision. The host state's maritime authority, whose vessel registry the founding module's initial registration used as the legal category closest to the floating structure in water, is recognized in the Principality deal as the alternative registration authority for the cenote installation's physical extent beyond the founding module. The marine registry provision does not create a cadastral parcel. The host state's maritime authority's vessel registry does not contain cadastral parcels, because the vessel is a mobile floating object rather than a fixed location parcel of land. But the marine registry provision creates the authoritative registration that the host state's legal system recognizes as the documentation of the installation's legal existence within the host state's jurisdiction. The marine registry's registration is not a perfect fit for the fixed floating installation in the cenote's geological void. The vessel registry was developed for mobile floating objects that navigate between ports and whose legal status requires the flag state's authority and the port state's jurisdiction to be defined at each port of call. The cenote installation does not navigate. It does not have a flag state relationship in the maritime law sense. The marine registry's conceptual framework does not fully accommodate the cenote installation's legal reality. But the marine registry is the closest available registration mechanism within the host state's existing legal framework, and the Principality deal's recognition framework accepts the imperfect fit as the pragmatic alternative to the non-registration that the land registry's inapplicability produces. An imperfectly registered installation is legally more established than an unregistered installation, and the marine registry's registration is the legal basis from which the Principality deal's progressive expansion toward more appropriate legal recognition can proceed. The marine registry's registration is the floating title's current legal anchor, the point in the legal system where the floating title's documentation is registered in an authoritative record, imperfectly, in the category that the legal system's existing taxonomy provides as the closest approximation. The legal gap's closure, when it comes, will replace the marine registry's imperfect registration with the novel legal category's appropriate registration mechanism, the registered inhabited geological formations title that the surface world's legal system has not yet developed but that the Principality's habitation records accumulation is building the evidence base for. The habitation records architecture. The habitation record is the floating title's most important evidentiary component and the one that the Principality's legal strategy treats with the most rigorous documentation discipline. The continuous, uninterrupted, digitally signed record of the permanent resident population's presence in the installation that the coordinating system's access management protocol generates at every wetlock transition event. The habitation record's architecture reflects the legal standards requirements. The continuous habitation claim that the novel legal category's foundation requires must be documented at the evidentiary standard that the legal proceeding would apply if the novel category's recognition were challenged in an international legal forum. The documentation must be authentic, produced by the coordinating system's access management protocol's automated record generation rather than by the Principality's official's manual entry. It must be continuous, uninterrupted across the full period from the founding installation's first permanent resident's first night of occupancy to the current date. And it must be tamper-evident, the Digital Twins Commons Governance Archives blockchain analog integrity verification that the REDIRA framework's records management specification requires for all governance records that the Principality's legal strategy depends on. The authentic, continuous, tamper-evident habitation record is the digital equivalent of the land registry's authoritative title, not registered in the state's official record, but documented at the evidentiary standard that the state's official record's authentication procedures would require if the state's legal framework provided the appropriate legal category for the installation's registration. The habitation record's authentication is the coordinating system's most legally significant technical function, the biometric identification of each individual at the wetlock's access management protocol's transition event, the iris scan, the dermal ridge pattern, the acoustic voice print, that the REDIRA framework's identity management system maintains as the permanent resident population's identity registry. The biometric identification produces the authenticated presence record, the legally attributable documentation that this specific individual was present in the installation's atmospheric interior at this specific time, authenticated by the biometric verification that the identity management system's archive confirms against the registered biometric profile. The biometric authentication's legal significance is the individual's presence record's admissibility in the legal proceeding. The authenticated biometric presence record is the evidentiary documentation that the individual was inside the installation at the documented time, not the self-report that the individual's testimony would produce, not the official certification that the access control record's manual entry would require, but the automated biometric verification that the coordinating systems access management protocol generates without human intermediation and stores in the digital twin's tamper-evident archive. The authenticated biometric presence records aggregate, every individual's presence record across the full habitation period, is the habitation documentation's evidentiary core, the proof, at biometric authentication's evidentiary standard, that specific individuals have been continuously present in the installation's atmospheric interior across the period that the continuous habitation claim requires. The threshold. The Founding Charter's habitation threshold specifies the minimum permanent resident population density and the minimum occupancy continuity that the habitation record must document for the continuous habitation claim's legal maintenance, not any individual's continuous physical presence without departure, which the Terraform operator's Surface World medical appointments and the Research Commons conference presentations would regularly interrupt, but the aggregate population's continuous presence at the minimum density that the Founding Charter specifies as the habitation threshold. The threshold has two components, the population component and the continuity component. The population component specifies the minimum permanent resident count, the number of individuals who have completed the permanent residency protocol's authorization requirements and who are recorded in the habitation record as current permanent residents, that the installation must maintain in the atmospheric interior at any moment. The continuity component specifies the minimum fraction of the calendar year during which the population component's minimum count must be satisfied in the aggregate, the fraction of time during which the installation's permanent resident population's present members collectively satisfy the minimum count. The threshold-specific numerical values are the Founding Charter's classified content, the legal strategies assessment of the appropriate evidentiary standard for the novel legal category's continuous habitation claim does not benefit from public disclosure, because the host state's regulatory authority that the threshold-specific values would inform could use the threshold knowledge to design enforcement actions that displace the installation's permanent resident population below the threshold without triggering the evacuation protocol's safety response. The threshold's existence and its two-component architecture are public governance knowledge. The permanent resident population must understand the governance objective that the habitation record serves in order to make the informed residency decisions that the continuous habitation's maintenance requires. The threshold-specific values are governance intelligence whose protection the classified archives access protocol maintains. The population component's maintenance is the Founding Charter's residency incentive structure's design objective, the permanent residency protocol's authorization requirements, the longevity program's extended enrollment pathway that precedes the permanent residency application, and the governance participation rights that the permanent residency's Redeemer framework integration provides are all designed to produce the permanent resident population's organic growth toward and maintenance above the threshold's minimum count. The growth is not compelled. The Founding Charter's sovereignty provisions explicitly prohibit any compulsion of residency decisions. It is incentivized. The longevity program's biological evidence of the therapeutic benefit, the Research Commons scientific community's collaborative attraction, the governance participation rights civic engagement, and the formation's extraordinary ecological encounter that the permanent residents describe as the residence's defining characteristic. All of these are the incentive structure's components that the Principality's visitor experience, longevity program, and governance architecture together produce as the organic motivation for the voluntary residency decisions that the continuous habitation's maintenance requires. The anchor commitment's legal dimension. The anchor commitment that the Founding Charter's expansion protocol specifies as the geological management's primary decision point, the commitment that converts the floating installation into the fixed structure whose anchor pylons connect the crystal tube network to the limestone substrate, is simultaneously the floating title's most significant legal transition. Before the anchor commitment, the installation is the floating structure that the Marine Registry's vessel registration documents, a mobile floating object in the cenote's freshwater zone, registered under the Maritime Law's vessel framework, with the legal status that the vessel registration provides and the limitations that the vessel framework's navigation requirement implies for the fixed floating installation's legal categorization. After the anchor commitment, the installation is no longer floating in the strict physical sense. The anchor pylon's physical connection to the limestone substrate fixes the installation's position in the three-dimensional geological void that the installation survey documents. The physical transition from floating to fixed changes the legal analysis. The fixed structure in the geological void is not a vessel navigating between ports. It is a fixed installation permanently attached to the geological formation at specific three-dimensional coordinates. The fixed installation's legal status in the Marine Registry's vessel framework is the Principality deal's negotiating challenge. The Maritime Law's vessel framework applies to mobile floating objects, not to fixed installations permanently attached to the geological substrate. An anchor-committed installation is not a vessel in the Maritime Law's conceptual framework, and the Marine Registry's registration of an anchor-committed installation as a vessel is the legal fiction that the Principality deal's recognition framework must negotiate with the host state's maritime authority. The legal fiction's acceptance by the host state's maritime authority is the Principality deal's most critical recognition provision. the acknowledgement that the anchor-committed installation will continue to be registered in the Marine Registry's vessel framework despite not being a vessel in the conventional maritime law sense, because the Marine Registry is the available registration mechanism that the Principality Deals Recognition Framework has established as the alternative registration authority for the installation's legal documentation. The legal fiction's maintenance across the anchor commitment's multiple events. Each new cenote installation's anchor commitment produces a new fixed installation that the Marine Registry's vessel framework must accommodate as another non-navigating vessel, is the Principality Deal's progressive strain. The host state's maritime authority's willingness to register an increasing number of anchor-committed fixed installations as vessels under the maritime laws framework is not unlimited. The progressive strain is the legal strategy's most immediate pressure. The accumulation of anchor-committed installations in the Marine Registry's vessel framework eventually reaches the point at which the Maritime Authority's institutional resistance to the legal fiction requires the legal category's clarification that the Principality Deals Recognition Framework has been deferring. The legal category's clarification, when it comes, is the productive ambiguity's productive output, the moment at which the host state's legal framework must develop the category for the anchor-committed installation in the geological void that the Marine Registry's vessel framework cannot indefinitely accommodate. The novel category's development is the legal gap's closure, the legal system's development of the inhabited geological formation's legal category that the Principality's habitation record, governance record, and Marine Registry's accumulated registrations have provided the evidence base for. The Principality is managing the progressive strain to arrive at the category's clarification at the moment when the habitation record's evidence base is strongest, the governance record's effective governance demonstration is most fully documented, and the Principality Deals Recognition Framework's progressive expansion has established the host state's institutional familiarity with the Principality's legal status that the novel category's recognition requires. The timing is the legal strategy's most sensitive management challenge. The progressive strain's acceleration and the habitation record's accumulation rate must converge at the moment of maximum legal advantage, when the evidence is strongest and the host state's institutional resistance to the novel category is weakest. The Legal Counsel's classified archive is the convergence assessment's repository. The Principality's legal strategy is the convergence management's operational plan. The floating title is the convergence management's instrument. The digital twin is title deed. The digital twin is the Principality's most comprehensive legal document, the continuously updated, tamper-evident, computationally authenticated record of the installation's physical extent, biological condition, geological integrity, governance decisions, habitation history, and engineering specifications that the coordinating system maintains as the formation intelligence record's primary data source. The digital twin as title deed is not a metaphor. The founding charter explicitly designates the digital twin's specific data layers as the floating title's evidentiary components, the construction layer's installation survey as the spatial reference, the biological monitoring layer's habitation documentation as the occupancy evidence, and the governance archive's deliberative records as the effective governance demonstration. The three designations together constitute the founding charter's claim that the digital twin's specific data layers are the floating title's legal documentation. The digital twin's authenticity is the foundation charter's legal claim's strength. The coordinating system's sensor network generates the data continuously and autonomously. The digital twin's computational verification checks each data entry against the preceding entry's cryptographic signatures. And the blockchain analog integrity verification's tamper evidence confirms that no retroactive modification has altered the historical record since the original data entry's timestamp. The tamper evidence is the digital twin's most legally significant technical property. The title deed that cannot be retroactively altered is the title deed that the legal proceeding cannot challenge as fabricated after the fact. The Physical Land Registry's title deed's authenticity rests on the state's official certification and the registry's physical security against unauthorized modification. The digital twin's title deed's authenticity rests on the cryptographic integrity verification's computational proof that the historical record's content has not been modified since the original entry's timestamps. The cryptographic integrity verification is the digital twin's most legally specific engineering provision. The Redeem Framework's records management specifications blockchain analog implementation was specified with the legal proceedings evidentiary standard in mind, the cryptographic proof that is computationally verifiable without the state's official certification, that is tamper evident through the hash chain's integrity rather than through the physical security that the official registry's document management requires, and that is continuously produced as the coordinating system's automated data generation rather than the periodically certified records that the official registry's update cycle produces. The digital twin's title deed is more technically sophisticated and legally more novel than the land registry's conventional title deed. It is also, at the current stage of the legal system's development, less legally established. The legal systems tribunals have not yet developed the doctrinal framework for evaluating the cryptographic integrity verification's evidentiary weight in the property law's contexts that the conventional title deed's authenticity standards were developed for. The legal system's doctrinal development of the cryptographic integrity verification's evidentiary standard is the parallel track to the inhabited geological formation's legal category development. Both require the legal system's institutional development of the novel categories analysis framework. And both are under development in the legal scholarship and the emerging tribunal practice that the Principality's Research Commons legal publications contribute to. The Principality's legal research output, the publications in the international property laws journals, the presentations at the comparative laws conferences, the amicus briefs in the jurisdictions where the novel category's preliminary questions are being litigated in adjacent legal contexts, is the legal strategy's most publicly visible dimension, the scholarly contribution to the legal development that the Principality's interest requires, conducted through the Research Commons. Academic legitimacy rather than through the advocacy that the Principality's direct legal interest would undermine in the scholarly community's assessment. The Research Commons publishes the scholarship. The scholarship develops the doctrine. The doctrine supports the legal category. The legal category gives the floating title conventional legal effect. The conventional legal effect is what the floating title is building toward. The habitation record's generational dimension. The habitation record's most legally significant evidentiary property is its temporal extent. A continuous habitation record that has been accumulating for 50 years is a fundamentally different evidentiary basis for the novel legal category's recognition than a habitation record that has been accumulating for 5 years, even if both are authentic, continuous, and tamper-evident. The 50-year habitation record demonstrates what the 5-year record cannot demonstrate: the generational permanence of the inhabited geological formation's civilizational commitment, the evidence that the community's presence in the formation is not a temporary occupation that the community will abandon when the economic incentive changes, but the civilization's long-term relationship with the formation that the founding charter's 1,000-year design life and the multigenerational resident population's continued presence documents as the civilizational permanence that the novel legal category requires. The generational dimension is the habitation record's most powerful legal argument. The international law's recognition of territorial sovereignty is not typically awarded to communities whose claim is based on a few years of occupation, regardless of the occupation's authenticity and governance quality. The recognition is more naturally associated with the communities whose claim is based on the generational continuity that establishes the community's connection to the territory as the civilizational identity rather than the temporary occupation. The children born in the installation, the municipality's first generation of native-born permanent residents whose entire life has been lived in the formation's conditions, are the habitation record's most powerful evidence. Their presence as permanent residents, their governance participation in the Redeemer framework's deliberative processes, and their biological development in the formation's specific conditions all contribute to the habitation record's generational dimension in the way that no adult resident's extended enrollment can fully replicate. The children's medical records, the pediatric hyperbaric exposure dataset that Chapter 4 Part 8 identified as the municipality's most important current research priority, are the habitation record's most personally meaningful component and the one whose implications the Principality's legal counsel is most careful to address in the legal strategy's ethical framework. The children's medical data is their own, not the Principality's legal instrument, and the Principality's use of the children's presence as evidence for the novel legal category's recognition must be balanced against the children's right to make their own decisions about their identity's relationship to the Principality's legal claims. The founding charter's children's governance provision addresses this balance. The native-born permanent residents reach the governance participation age at which the Redeemer framework's full citizenship rights extend to them, and the governance participation rights include the individual's capacity to elect the residency status that best represents their own civic identity, the Principality's permanent resident status, the host state's conventional citizenship through the host state's naturalization framework, or a combination of the two that the Principality deal's dual recognition provision allows where the host state's legal framework permits. The native-born generation's individual elections of their civic identity are the habitation record's most legally significant events. The generation that was born in the formation and reaches adulthood choosing to remain as the Principality's permanent residence is the generational continuity that the recognized territorial entity's long-term legitimacy requires. The generation that was born in the formation and chooses to leave, to become exclusively the host state's citizens living in the surface world, is the community's capacity for individual freedom that the Principality's governance philosophy requires as the foundation of the civilizational relationship that the founding charter's sovereignty provisions are built on. The habitation record records both choices, the native-born residents who remain and those who leave. The legal claim's generational dimension rests on the community of those who remain, who choose the formation's conditions as their civilizational identity rather than the surface world's alternatives. The community's authentic choice is the legal claim's moral foundation. The authentic choice is what distinguishes the Principality's sovereignty claim from the occupation that the international law's decolonization norms would not recognize as legitimate. The Principality does not compel anyone to stay. The Principality offers the formation's conditions, the governance participation rights, the longevity program's biological evidence, and the ecological encounter that the formation provides. The individuals who choose to stay are making the civilizational choice that the habitation record documents as the continuous permanent habitation's evidence. The habitation record's generational dimension is the accumulated record of the community's continuous choices to stay. The community that has chosen to stay, generation after generation, across the temporal span that the habitation record documents, is the community whose civilizational relationship with the formation the novel legal categories recognition would establish as the territorial sovereignty that the formation's permanent inhabitation creates. The legal gap closes when enough generations have made the choice, and the documentation is complete enough, and the legal development has progressed far enough, that the international legal system's recognition of the novel category becomes the legal consequence of the evidence that the habitation record has accumulated. The principality is accumulating the evidence. Generation by generation. Choice by choice. Record by record. The legal gap is closing from the inside. Cross-references, Part 1, CH4, Floating before anchoring, Part 2, CH4, The Crystal Tube Standard, Part 8, Section A, CH4, From Resort to Municipality, Part 9, CH1, The Legal Gap, Part 9, CH3, Strategic Duplicity, Part 9, CH4, Redeemer as Governance OS, Part 9, CH6, Distributed Sanctuary, Part 10, CH6, ASI as Co-Creating Partner. For floating title documentation components and digital twin legal designation protocol, see Appendix H, Governance Operations Manual. For habitation record biometric authentication specification and blockchain analog integrity verification protocol, see Appendix H, Governance Operations Manual. For marine registry registration protocol and anchor commitment legal transition documentation, see Appendix H, Governance Operations Manual. For children's governance provision and native-born resident civic identity election protocol, see Appendix H, Governance Operations Manual. For digital twin tamper evidence cryptographic specification and records management blockchain analog implementation, see Appendix G, Formation Intelligence Record. Pipe Dream. Part 9, The Sovereign Principality. Chapter 3, Strategic Duplicity. Strategic duplicity is not deception. The distinction is important enough to justify its own chapter before the chapter's argument begins, because the surface world's moral vocabulary has trained the reader to hear duplicity as a synonym for dishonesty, and the Founding Charter's use of the term as a constitutional principle requires the reader to understand what kind of duplicity the Founding Charter is specifying and why the Founding Charter's ethical framework treats it not as a necessary evil to be minimized but as a positive institutional design requirement to be maintained with the same rigor as any other constitutional provision. Deception is the representation of a false state of affairs as true, with the intent to cause the deceived party to act on the false representation in ways that harm the deceived party or benefit the deceiver at the deceived party's expense. Deception is what the Amazon installation's governance failure produced, the reclassification of the variance reports that accurately described a deteriorating formation as reports that described an acceptable formation, causing the monitoring authority's institutional leadership to act on the false representation by continuing operations that the accurate representation would have required them to discontinue. The deceiver benefited, the installation's operations continued, the revenue continued, the institutional leadership's positions continued. The deceived party, in the Amazon case, the formation and the community that depended on it, was harmed. Strategic duplicity is the maintenance of two simultaneous representations of the principality's legal and political status, one representation directed toward the surface world's institutions whose recognition the principality requires for operational legitimacy, and a second representation that constitutes the principality's actual self-understanding as expressed in the Founding Charter's governance architecture, the Redeemer Framework's constitutional provisions, and the permanent resident community's civic identity. The two representations are not contradictory in the factual sense. The principality does not claim to the surface world's institutions that it is not a self-governing community with sovereign aspirations, and does not claim to its permanent residents that it is merely a commercial facility operating under the host state's jurisdiction. The two representations differ in emphasis, in the level of detail they provide about the principality's governance philosophy, and in the political and legal implications they foreground or background depending on the audience and the institutional context. The surface world's institutions receive the representation that the principality deals recognition framework establishes as the appropriate level of legal and political disclosure for the operational relationship that the tourism program, the research commons, and the longevity program require with the host state's regulatory framework. The permanent resident community's governance receives the representation that the Founding Charter's full constitutional architecture provides as the governance framework's complete specification, including the sovereignty aspirations, the legal strategy's long-term objectives, and the principality deal's negotiating history that the operational relationship's surface representation does not foreground. Strategic duplicity is not two lies. It is two truths, selectively presented to the audiences whose institutional contexts require different levels of the full truth's disclosure for the principality's operational sustainability and legal strategy's advancement. The institutional ecology. The surface world's institutional ecology, the network of state authorities, regulatory bodies, international organizations, commercial counterparties, and media institutions that the principality's operations intersect with, is not a single audience with a single information need. It is a diverse ecosystem of actors with different institutional mandates, different information asymmetries, different temporal perspectives on the principality's legal status, and different capacities to act on the information they have access to. The host state's tourism regulatory authority needs to know that the principality's visitor experience program meets the safety and quality standards that the tourism framework requires. The host state's environmental regulatory body needs to know that the cenote's ecological management meets the water quality and biodiversity standards that the environmental framework requires. The host state's immigration authority needs to know that the permanent resident population's visa documentation meets the residential status requirements that the immigration framework requires. The international research community needs to know that the Research Commons scientific program meets the academic integrity and ethics standards that the publication record requires. None of these institutional actors needs to know the principality's detailed legal strategy for developing the inhabited geological formation's novel legal category. None of them needs to know the habitation record's specific threshold values. None of them needs to know the Classified Archives Legal Counsel assessment of the productive ambiguity's current management position. None of them needs to know the founding charter's full sovereignty aspirations temporal horizon. Each institutional actor's information need is bounded by the institutional mandate that the actor is executing. The tourism regulator's mandate is tourism safety, not principality sovereignty. The environmental regulator's mandate is ecological protection, not legal category development. The immigration authority's mandate is residential status documentation, not civilizational political philosophy. The strategic duplicity's operational expression is matching the information provided to each institutional actor to the institutional mandate that the actor is executing, rather than providing the full disclosure that would be appropriate for an interlocutor whose mandate encompasses the principality's full legal and political status. This is not deception. Every institutional actor in the host state's regulatory framework knows that the principality has governance aspirations that extend beyond the regulatory compliance framework scope. The principality deal's negotiating history makes this explicit. The host state's legal counsel who negotiated the principality deal's terms is not unaware that the habitation records accumulation is building toward the sovereignty recognition that the principality deal's recognition framework is intended to advance. The host state's awareness of the principality's full governance philosophy is not the strategic duplicity's target. The strategic duplicity's target is the institutional actor's operational behavior within their specific mandates. The tourism regulator who knows the principality has sovereignty aspirations but whose operational mandate is tourism safety will continue to apply the tourism safety framework as the relevant standard for the regulatory interaction, because the sovereignty aspiration is not within the tourism regulatory mandate scope. The strategic duplicity succeeds not by deceiving the institutional actor about the principality's full identity but by ensuring that the regulatory interaction remains within the institutional mandate scope rather than escalating to the political level at which the sovereignty aspiration would become the primary issue. The strategic duplicity's goal is not concealment. It is scope management, maintaining each regulatory interaction within the institutional mandate that the interaction's regulatory function requires, rather than allowing any interaction to expand into the political assessment of the principality's sovereignty aspiration that would require the host state's political institutions, rather than the operational regulatory bodies, to address the principality's full legal and political status before the habitation record's evidence base is strong enough to support the sovereignty recognition's political negotiation. The timing principle. The founding charter's strategic duplicity provision includes the timing principle. The disclosure's level must increase as the habitation record's evidence base strengthens, the governance record's effective governance demonstration matures, and the legal category's doctrinal development progresses. The strategic duplicity is not a permanent posture of minimal disclosure, it is a dynamic posture whose disclosure level increases as the principality's legal position strengthens toward the full sovereignty recognition that the novel category's establishment would provide. The timing principle is the strategic duplicity's ethical foundation, a disclosure posture that maintains minimal disclosure permanently, regardless of how strong the principality's legal position has become, is a disclosure posture that is using the strategic duplicity's institutional scope management as a permanent shield against the political accountability that the sovereignty aspiration requires. That is deception in the political sense, using the institutional framework scope limitations to avoid the political consequences that full disclosure would produce rather than using the institutional framework scope limitations to manage the timing of disclosure that full disclosure at the current stage would harm rather than advance. The timing principle distinguishes strategic duplicity from deception by the trajectory. The principality's disclosure posture is increasing over time as the legal position strengthens, moving toward the full political disclosure of the sovereignty aspiration that the direct negotiation with the host state's political institutions would require for the novel category's recognition. The strategic duplicity's minimal disclosure at the early stage is the staging of the full disclosure at the stage when the full disclosure's political negotiation can succeed, not the permanent avoidance of the political accountability that the sovereignty aspiration demands. The timing principle's specific schedule is the legal counsel's classified archive's most sensitive content, the assessment of when the habitation record's evidence base, the governance record's demonstration, and the legal category's doctrinal development have together reached the threshold at which the full disclosure's political negotiation with the host state's political institutions can succeed rather than prematurely exposing the sovereignty aspiration to the political resistance that the premature disclosure would generate. The threshold assessment is not a single point, it is a range whose lower bound is the minimum evidence base at which the sovereignty recognition negotiation has a better than even probability of success based on the legal counsel's analysis of comparable cases in the international law's history, and whose upper bound is the maximum delay beyond which the strategic duplicity scope management has become the deception that the timing principle prohibits. The upper bound is the ethical constraint. The legal counsel's classified archive must contain the upper bound assessment alongside the lower bound strategic assessment, and the Redeem Framework's legal committee must report annually to the Governance Council that the upper bound has not been reached, that the strategic duplicity's current posture remains within the timing principle's ethical limits rather than having crossed into the deception that the timing principle's upper bound defines. The outward face. The principality's outward face, the representation that the surface world's institutional ecology encounters in the regulatory interactions, the commercial relationships, and the public communications, is organized around three primary framings that the founding charter's communications protocol specifies as the outward representation's constituent elements. The first framing is the therapeutic tourism and wellness destination, the principality as the world's most exceptional longevity program environment, whose therapeutic depth, research commons longitudinal dataset, and ecological encounter together produce the premium wellness experience that the surface world's medical tourism market increasingly recognizes as the frontier of evidence-based longevity medicine. This framing is completely accurate. The longevity program is genuinely the world's most sophisticated evidence-based longevity intervention, the longitudinal dataset is genuinely the most comprehensive of its kind, and the ecological encounter is genuinely unlike anything the surface world provides as a therapeutic context. The therapeutic tourism framing is not the principality's full identity, but it is the identity's dimension that the host state's tourism regulatory framework, the medical tourism market's commercial counterparties, and the research community's academic publishers engage with as the relevant institutional interface. The tourism regulator applies the tourism framework. The pharmaceutical licensing partner applies the research licensing framework. The academic journal applies the publication standards framework. None of these institutional interactions requires the principality's full constitutional architecture to be disclosed for the interaction to proceed at the appropriate level of institutional engagement. The second framing is the Ecological Management Research Station, the principality as the world's most comprehensively instrumented underwater ecological monitoring installation, whose research commons longitudinal biological dataset, geological monitoring record, and aquifer management protocol together constitute the most valuable freshwater cave ecology research program in existence. This framing is also completely accurate. The biological monitoring network's continuous data generation, the geological model's formation intelligence record, and the water stewardship program's 100-year data accumulation are the most comprehensive research dataset in freshwater cave biology. The research station framing is the identity's dimension that the host state's environmental regulatory body, the international research community's funding institutions, and the academic publishing infrastructure engage with as the relevant institutional interface. The environmental regulator applies the ecological protection framework. The research funding institution applies the research quality standards. The academic publisher applies the peer review standards. The research station framing meets each of these institutional requirements without requiring the principality's sovereignty aspiration to be disclosed as the governance architecture that the research program is embedded in. The third framing is the Responsible Aquaculture Innovation Center, the principality as the world's most ecologically integrated aquaculture production system, whose living pantry's closed-loop design, vertical production efficiency, and biological maintenance crew together demonstrate the food production paradigm that the surface world's aquaculture industry is beginning to recognize as the framework that the climate disruption's agricultural impact requires the tropical coastal regions to adopt. This framing is the most recently developed and the one whose institutional relationships, with the food security institutions, the development assistance programs, and the sustainable agriculture research community, are the most nascent in the principality's outward engagement. The three framings are not masks that conceal the principality's actual identity. They are dimensions of the principality's actual identity, selectively emphasized in the institutional interactions where those dimensions are the relevant interface for the institutional mandate that the interacting actor is executing. The principality is genuinely a therapeutic tourism destination, genuinely an ecological research station, and genuinely an aquaculture innovation center. The principality is also a self-governing community with a sovereignty aspiration, a legal strategy for developing the inhabited geological formation's novel legal category, and a founding charter's constitutional architecture that the Redeem Framework implements as the governance operating system. All of these are true. The strategic duplicity selects which truths to foreground in each institutional context, not which truths to assert against the evidence. The inward face. The principality's inward face, the representation that the permanent resident community's governance operates within, is the founding charter's full constitutional architecture, the sovereignty aspirations temporal horizon, the legal strategies classified archive, the habitation records threshold specification, the strategic duplicities timing principle and ethical constraints, and the redeem framework's complete governance specifications including the classified content whose access the legal committee's authorization protocol restricts. The inward face is not the outward face's opposite, it does not reveal what the outward face conceals in the deceptive sense. It provides the full context that the permanent resident community's self-governance requires to make the informed civic decisions that the redeem framework's deliberative processes produce. The permanent resident who is making a governance decision about the longevity program's pricing structure, or the aquaculture commons quota allocation, or the expansion program's next cenote installations deployment schedule, is making a governance decision that the outward face's institutional relationships constrain and the inward face's full constitutional architecture contextualizes. The permanent resident's access to the inward face is the governance citizenship right that the Founding Charter's residency protocol establishes. The permanent resident who has completed the Redeem Framework's governance orientation program, whose biometric identity is registered in the Identity Management System's Permanent Resident Registry, and whose governance participation history confirms the civic engagement that the governance citizenship requires, has access to the governance archive's full content at the authorization level that the Redeem Framework's classified access protocol specifies for the resident's governance role. The Classified Access Protocol is not a secrecy framework that restricts permanent residents' access to information about their own governance. It is a security framework that restricts the information's access to the governance participants whose role requires the information's knowledge, distinguishing between the classified content that all permanent residents have access to through the governance orientation program's full disclosure and the classified content that only the legal committee's members have access to because the legal strategy's effectiveness depends on the host state's institutional actors not having simultaneous access to the complete legal strategy's assessment. The permanent resident's inward face access includes the full disclosure of the sovereignty aspiration's existence and its long-term horizon, the legal strategy's general approach including the habitation record's legal significance, the floating title's novel legal category claim, and the principality deal's progressive expansion objective, the strategic duplicity's constitutional status as a founding charter provision and its ethical constraints as the timing principle specifies, and the classified archive's existence and the Redeem Framework's legal committee's access authorization protocol. The classified archive-specific content, the legal counsel's current assessment of the productive ambiguities management position, the threshold assessment's specific values, and the host state's specific institutional actor's current disposition toward the sovereignty recognition, is the content that the legal committee's members' access authorization restricts. The permanent resident who is not a legal committee member knows that this content exists, knows that it is classified, knows the legal committee's authorization protocol, and has the governance participation right to seek election to the legal committee whose membership would provide the classified content's access. The inward face's full disclosure at the constitutional level, the permanent resident's complete understanding of what the principality is, what it aspires to, and how the strategic duplicity serves the aspiration, is the governance transparency that the Redeem Framework's commons governance philosophy requires. The strategic duplicity is not a secret from the permanent residents. It is a constitutional provision that the permanent residents govern according to the Redeem Framework's deliberative processes. The outward alignment's technical requirements. The outward alignment, the strategic duplicity's operational requirement that the principality's regulatory compliance with the host state's framework is genuine rather than performative, is the most demanding technical requirement of the Founding Charter's governance architecture. The outward alignment is not maintained by asserting compliance while operating outside the regulatory framework's actual requirements. It is maintained by genuinely meeting the regulatory framework's requirements in the operational dimensions that the institutional interactions address, while the governance architecture's full constitutional specifications extend beyond the regulatory framework scope in the dimensions that the institutional interactions do not address. The Tourism Regulatory Authority's framework requires the visitor experience program to meet the safety standards that the framework specifies. The Principality meets these standards genuinely. The Blackout Protocol, the Compartmentalized City Safety Architecture, the Pre-Dive Training Protocol, and the Terraform Operator's Concurrent Authorization are not regulatory theater designed to satisfy the tourism framework's requirements while concealing inferior practices. They are the Principality's actual safety architecture, designed to the standards that the formation's conditions and the Founding Charter's life safety specifications require, which are in every case at least as demanding as the tourism regulatory framework standards and in most cases more demanding. The outward alignment's genuineness is the strategic duplicity's most important technical requirement. The regulatory compliance that is genuine rather than performative is the compliance that survives the host state's regulatory inspection, the research community's peer review, and the environmental regulatory body's ecological assessment. The compliance that is performative, the theater of compliance that conceals actual practices below the regulatory framework's requirements, is the compliance that the host state's inspection discovers and that terminates the Principality deal's recognition framework's continuation. The genuine outward alignment is therefore not a constraint that the Principality's governance architecture accepts as the cost of operating within the host state's jurisdiction. It is the design principle that the founding charter specifies as the outward faces requirement. The principalities' operations must be genuinely compliant with the regulatory frameworks they engage with, because the genuine compliance is the sustainable compliance that the principalities' long-term legal strategy requires, and because the principalities' actual operational standards, the ecological management's ecological standard, the safety architecture's life safety standard, the research commons academic integrity standard, are the standards that the principalities' own governance philosophy requires regardless of the regulatory framework's requirements. The genuine outward alignment is the strategic duplicity's most demanding internal discipline. The governance architecture must ensure that the standards that the outward faces institutional interactions engage with are the standards that the inward faces full constitutional architecture specifies as the principality's actual governance requirements. Any divergence between the outward faces represented standards and the inward faces actual governance standards is the corruption that the strategic duplicity's ethical constraints prohibit. The Redeem Framework's conflict of interest disclosure requirement, the Terraform operator's concurrent authorization requirement, and the Governance Council's annual review of the outward alignment's genuine compliance are the institutional mechanisms that maintain the divergence prohibition. The governance processes that ensure the outward faces represented compliance is the inward faces actual compliance rather than the performance that the regulatory inspection's presence produces and the regulatory inspection's absence suspends. When the strategic duplicity fails. The strategic duplicity fails in two distinct ways, and the founding charter's strategic duplicity provision specifies the response to each failure mode. The first failure mode is the premature disclosure. The outward faces institutional interaction escalates to the level at which the sovereignty aspiration's full disclosure would be required for the interaction to proceed honestly, before the habitation record's evidence base has reached the threshold that the legal counsel's assessment identifies as sufficient for the sovereignty recognition negotiation's success. The premature disclosure exposes the sovereignty aspiration to the political institutions whose resistance the strategic duplicity has been managing the timing to avoid, before the principality's legal position is strong enough to sustain the political negotiation. The founding charter's response to the premature disclosure failure mode is the Principality Deals Renegotiation Protocol, the acknowledgement that the sovereignty aspiration exists, combined with the Principality Deals Recognition Framework's extension request, the negotiation of the expanded recognition terms that the premature disclosure's political context requires, using the habitation record's current evidence base and the governance record's current effective governance demonstration as the negotiating leverage that the current legal position provides. The renegotiation is not the strategic duplicity's failure's consequence in the deception's consequence sense. The host state's political institutions are not discovering a concealed truth that changes the principality deal's legal basis. They are engaging with the principality's full governance philosophy at a political level that the strategic duplicity's scope management has been deferring until the principality's legal position was stronger. The premature disclosure accelerates the political engagement before the optimal position is reached, but the political engagement itself was always the intended outcome of the habitation record's accumulation strategy. The second failure mode is the outward alignment's divergence. The principality's actual operational practices fall below the represented standards that the outward faces institutional interactions have established as the regulatory compliance framework. This failure mode is the corruption that the strategic duplicity's ethical constraints prohibit, the performative compliance that the timing principle's upper bounds deception definition captures as the ethical boundary that the strategic duplicity must not cross. The founding charter's response to the outward alignment's divergence failure mode is the governance architecture's integrity protocol, the Terraform operator's concurrent authorization revocation, the Redeem Framework's conflict resolution protocol's activation, and the Governance Council's emergency session that the founding charter's constitutional emergency provisions specify for the governance failure that the outward alignment's divergence represents. The governance architecture's integrity protocol's response is not the cover-up that the corrupt institution's response to discovered divergence typically produces. It is the institutional self-correction that the Redeem Framework's constitutional architecture requires when the governance failure is identified. The integrity protocol's effectiveness depends on the institutional culture that the strategic duplicity's inward face maintains, the permanent resident community's understanding that the outward alignment's genuine compliance is not merely the regulatory requirement but the principality's governance philosophy's requirement, that the principality does not need the regulatory framework to compel the genuine compliance because the governance philosophy requires it independently of any external framework's demands. The community that understands the genuine compliance as the governance philosophy's requirement rather than the regulatory framework's imposition is the community that maintains the outward alignment's genuineness in the regulatory inspection's absence as well as in its presence. The genuine compliance is the compliance that is the same whether or not anyone is watching, the compliance that is the governance philosophy's expression rather than the regulatory framework's compliance theater. The Amazon Lesson Revisited. The prologue's Amazon lesson established the founding charter's negative case, the civilization that exploited its formation, reclassified the variance reports that documented the degradation, and ultimately produced the collapse that the honest reporting would have allowed governance to prevent. The Amazon failure is the founding charter's primary cautionary reference, the civilizational failure that the founding charter's every design decision is oriented toward not repeating. The strategic duplicity's relationship to the Amazon lesson is the most sensitive intersection in the founding charter's governance philosophy. A governance architecture that maintains two simultaneous representations of the principality's identity could be the Amazon reclassification's institutional form, the governance mechanism that conceals the variance reports from the regulatory authority by representing the formation's condition to the regulatory framework as within acceptable bounds, while the inward governance's full assessment acknowledges the degradation. The founding charter's strategic duplicity provision must therefore address the Amazon lesson explicitly. The strategic duplicity that the founding charter specifies is not the Amazon's outward representation of a degrading formation as a healthy one. The Amazon's outward representation was factually false. The variance reports accurately described a deteriorating formation that the outward representation characterized as acceptable. The principality's outward representation is factually true, the regulatory framework's requirements are genuinely met, the ecological standards are genuinely maintained, the safety architecture genuinely functions as the life safety specification requires. The Amazon's failure was the factual falsification of the formation's condition. The principality's strategic duplicity is the contextual selection of which truths to foreground in each institutional interaction. The distinction is the ethic's most important distinction, a representation that foregrounds different truths in different institutional contexts while every represented truth is accurate is not the representation that an accurate truth suppression by an inaccurate representation constitutes. The Redeem framework's constitutional protection of the digital twins formation intelligence record is the strategic duplicity's most important ethical safeguard. The formation's condition is always documented accurately in the Digital Twins Commons Governance Archive, accessible to the Research Commons scientific community, the Governance Council's annual review, and the Terraform operator's professional assessment. The outward representation's regulatory interactions engage with the formation's condition at the level that the regulatory mandate addresses. The Digital Twins Formation Intelligence Record maintains the full accurate assessment independently of and simultaneously with the outward representation's contextually selected truths. The Digital Twins accurate full record and the outward representation's contextually selected truths coexist without contradiction. The outward representation does not assert anything that the Digital Twins full record contradicts. The Digital Twins full record does not reveal anything that the outward representation has falsified. The two representations are not in conflict because neither contains a falsification. One contains the selection appropriate to the institutional context, the other contains the full accurate assessment. The Amazon's failure was the absence of the full accurate assessment in any accessible record. The variance reports were reclassified as acceptable, the full record was destroyed, and the institutional knowledge of the formation's deterioration was suppressed. The principality's strategic duplicity maintains the full accurate assessment in the Digital Twins Tamper-Evident Commons Governance Archive while managing the institutional context's information through the contextual selection rather than the factual suppression. The Amazon suppressed the truth. The principality selects among truths. The distinction is the ethics ground. The sovereign's obligation. The principality's sovereign aspiration. The governance philosophies claim that the inhabited geological formation's permanent community has the right to self-governance that the novel legal categories recognition would establish as the territorial sovereignty, carries the obligations that the sovereignty claim requires for its moral legitimacy. The sovereignty claim's moral legitimacy requires that the community whose self-governance the sovereignty would establish is a genuine community, not an assemblage of temporary visitors whose presence is the economic incentives product rather than the civilizational commitments expression, not a governance structure whose constitutional architecture serves the founding shareholders' commercial interests rather than the permanent resident community's civic well-being, and not a legal strategy whose legal category development serves the principality's commercial advantage rather than the genuine civilizational relationship with the formation that the sovereignty claim's permanent territorial commitment requires. The strategic duplicity's outward face serves the commercial interests that the longevity program, the tourism program, and the research commons licensing income represent. The outward face's success is the economic foundation for the governance architecture's operation and the legal strategy's advancement. But the outward face's commercial function must not become the governance philosophy's primary function. The principality must not become the commercial facility that the outward face's therapeutic tourism framing represents rather than the self-governing community that the inward face's full constitutional architecture constitutes. The sovereign's obligation is the governance philosophy's integrity. The principality's governance architecture must genuinely serve the permanent resident community's civic well-being, the formation's ecological integrity, and the research commons scientific contribution as the primary governance objectives, with the commercial function serving these primary objectives as the economic foundation rather than the commercial function serving as the primary objectives that the governance architecture serves. The Redeem Framework's Commons Governance Protocol is the sovereign's obligations' institutional expression. The governance decisions that the Redeem Framework's deliberative processes produce must reflect the permanent resident community's collective judgment about the primary governance objectives pursuit rather than the founding shareholders' commercial interest optimization. The founding shareholders' return structure, the common ownership principles expression in the economic architecture, is designed to align the founding shareholders' interest with the primary governance objectives pursuit rather than to subordinate the primary objectives to the commercial return optimization. The alignment's maintenance across the generational transitions that the design life imposes is the strategic duplicity's most demanding long-term requirement. The governance architecture that genuinely serves the primary objectives in the founding generation's tenure must continue to serve the primary objectives in the subsequent generation's governance, despite the commercial interests pressure that the economic architecture's evolution may introduce and the founding shareholders' institutional succession may produce. The strategic duplicity's inward face is the mechanism for this maintenance. The permanent resident community's full understanding of the governance philosophy's primary objectives and the commercial functions supporting role ensures that the community's governance decisions in the Redeemer framework's deliberative processes reflect the primary objectives pursuit rather than the commercial interest optimization. The community that understands what the principality is, not merely the outward face's commercial framing but the inward face's full constitutional architecture, is the community that governs the principality toward the primary objectives that the sovereignty claims moral legitimacy requires. The sovereign is obligated to the governed. The governed understand the governance. The governance pursues the sovereignty's primary objectives. The primary objectives are the sovereignty's moral legitimacy's foundation. Strategic duplicity is the instrument. The governance philosophy is the obligation. The permanent resident community's understanding of both is the principality's most essential resource. Cross-references, Part 1, ch 6, The Amazon Lesson, from Prologue, reference, Part 2, ch 2, Engineering Invisible Architecture, Part 8, Section A, ch 4, From Resort to Municipality, Part 9, ch 1, The Legal Gap, Part 9, ch 2, Floating Title and the Habitation Record, Part 9, ch 4, Redeemer's Governance OS, Part 9, ch 5, The Commons Ownership Principle, Part 9, ch 6, Distributed Sanctuary, Part 12, ch 5, Sans a priori. For strategic duplicity constitutional provision and timing principle ethical constraint specification, see Appendix H, Governance Operations Manual. For outward alignment genuine compliance verification protocol and Redeemer Framework Integrity Protocol for divergence response, see Appendix H, Governance Operations Manual. For classified archive access authorization protocol and legal committee membership governance participation right, see Appendix H, Governance Operations Manual. For 3 outward framings institutional interaction protocols and regulatory compliance documentation standard, see Appendix H, Governance Operations Manual. For Governance Council annual outward alignment compliance review and strategic duplicity timing principle assessment protocol, see Appendix H, Governance Operations Manual. Pipe Dream. Part 9, The Sovereign Principality. Chapter 4, Redeemer's Governance OS. Every governance system is a software system in the functional sense, a set of rules whose execution produces outputs from inputs, whose outputs feed back into subsequent inputs, whose edge cases produce either graceful degradation or catastrophic failure depending on whether the rule's authors anticipated the edge cases, and whose version history is the record of how the rule set has evolved in response to the failures and the unanticipated inputs that operation across time produces. The legislation, the constitutional provision, the administrative regulation, the judicial precedent, all of these are the rule set's entries, and the governance system's operation is the rule set's execution against the specific inputs that the governed community's political life generates. The surface world's governance systems are rule sets that were written by particular communities at particular historical moments, under the specific conditions of political compromise that the founding moment's coalition of interest required, and that have been modified by the subsequent rule-writing processes that the Constitution or the parliamentary tradition or the regulatory framework specifies as the rules for changing the rules. The surface world's governance systems are therefore historical artifacts, the constitutional framers' political philosophy expressed in the rule set that the framers could agree on, modified by the judicial interpretations that the constitutional text's application to unanticipated circumstances has produced, amended by the amendment procedures that the Constitution specifies, and overlaid by the legislative and regulatory additions that the parliamentary or presidential framework produces. The historical artifact's most significant characteristic is its path dependence. The rule set that exists today reflects the political history of every coalition that has written or modified a rule since the founding moment, and the path from the founding moment to the present is not the path that an architect with full knowledge of the present circumstances would have designed. The surface world's governance systems are not design systems. They are evolved systems, the accumulated product of historical contingency, political compromise, and the successive modifications that the rule-writing processes have applied to the founding artifact across the time since the founding moment. Redeemer is not an evolved system. It is a design system, a governance operating system whose architecture was specified by the founding charter's governance design process with full awareness of the design choices, their consequences, and the failure modes that the historical governance system's evolution has produced. Redeemer does not have a founding moments coalition of interest to satisfy. The Principality's founding did not require the political compromise between competing interest factions that the surface world's democratic governance's founding moments require. Because the Principality's founding required the voluntary agreement of the founding shareholders whose interests the founding charter's economic architecture explicitly aligns with the primary governance objectives. The absence of the founding coalition's political compromise is Redeemer's most important design advantage and its most significant governance risk. The advantage is that the governance architecture can be designed for the primary objectives without the compromises that the founding coalition's competing interests require. The risk is that the governance architecture without the founding coalition's political legitimacy must derive its legitimacy from the permanent resident community's voluntary participation rather than from the democratic mandate that the founding election's majority produces. Redeemer derives its legitimacy from the permanent resident community's voluntary participation because the permanent resident community's presence in the formation is itself voluntary. Every permanent resident has chosen to remain in the formation rather than return to the surface world's governance frameworks, and the ongoing choice to remain is the ongoing endorsement of the governance framework that the formation's inhabitation requires. The legitimacy is not the democratic mandate's product. It is the civilizational choice's continuous renewal. The operating system metaphor. The operating system metaphor is the founding charter's most useful conceptual framework for understanding what Redeemer does and what it does not do. An operating system is not the applications that run on it. The operating system provides the execution environment, the resource allocation, the process scheduling, the memory management, the input-output coordination, within which the applications perform their specific functions. The operating system does not determine what the applications do. The operating system determines the conditions under which the applications can operate, the resources available to each process, the scheduling priority that the resource allocation algorithm assigns, the memory boundaries that prevent one process from corrupting another state, and the input-output protocols that allow the processes to exchange data with each other and with the external environment. Redeemer's governance operating system does not determine what the Principality's governance decisions are. Redeemer determines the conditions under which the Principality's governance decisions can be made, the deliberative processes that the decision-making authority requires, the concurrent authorization structure that the decision's ecological and legal risk management demands, the conflict resolution protocol that the competing interests dispute requires, and the commons governance architecture that the shared resource management's collective action problem requires. The application that runs on Redeemer's governance operating system is the permanent resident community's collective judgment, the specific policy decisions, the specific resource allocations, the specific governance priorities that the community's deliberative processes produce within the framework conditions that Redeemer specifies. Redeemer does not specify what the expansion program's next deployment target should be. Redeemer specifies the decision process through which the Network Governance Council and the Terraform operator's concurrent authorization together produce the deployment decision. The decision is the application's output. The process is the operating system's provision. The operating system metaphor has a technical analogy that the founding charter's governance design team drew explicitly. The difference between the governance operating system and the governance application is the difference between a constitutional framework and a legislative program. The constitutional framework specifies the decision-making processes' constraints and the resource allocation's fundamental principles. The legislative program specifies the specific policies that the constrained process produces at any particular historical moment. Redeemer is the constitutional framework in this analogy, the specification of the decision-making process's constraints, the resource allocation's fundamental principles, and the institutional architecture that the Principality's governance requires across the thousand-year design life's full temporal span, regardless of what specific policies the deliberative processes produce in any particular governance cycle. The operating system must be more stable than the applications it runs. The operating system's stability is the application's operational reliability's foundation. The Redeemer framework's constitutional stability, the founding charter's amendment process's supermajority requirement, is the governance decision's reliability's institutional foundation. Governance decisions that depend on an unstable operating system are governance decisions whose outcomes are subject to the operating system's arbitrary modification at any subsequent governance cycle. Governance decisions that depend on the Redeemer framework's constitutional stability are decisions whose operating environment the deliberative process's participants can rely on across the temporal span that the long-horizon planning that the aquaforming doctrine requires demands. The four constitutional layers. Redeemer's constitutional architecture organizes the governance framework into four layers whose relationships to each other reflect the operating system metaphor's hierarchy of stability and modifiability. The foundational layer is the forming charter's unmodifiable provisions, the primary governance objectives, ecological integrity, permanent resident community well-being, research commons scientific contribution, whose status as the governance's purpose cannot be modified by any governance process that the Redeemer framework specifies. The foundational layer is the operating system's kernel, the code that runs at the highest privilege level, that the application cannot modify without replacing the operating system itself, and that the governance architecture's entire edifice depends on for its structural integrity. The foundational layer's unmodifiability is the governance philosophy's most controversial provision and the one that the permanent resident community's governance debates return to most frequently. A governance framework that specifies purposes whose modification it prohibits is a governance framework that constrains the community's self-governance at the level of the community's fundamental objectives. The community cannot decide, through any deliberative process that Redeemer specifies, that the ecological integrity is not a primary governance objective. The foundational layer specifies this constraint, and the community's acceptance of the foundational layer is the civilizational choice that the Permanent Residency Protocol requires as the precondition for full citizenship rights. The community that does not accept the foundational layer's constraints has the right to leave, to exercise the sovereignty provision's explicit right to depart from the formation and return to the surface world's governance frameworks. The community that remains has accepted the foundational layer's constraints as the terms of the civilizational relationship. The constraint is not the community's limitation. It is the civilizational commitment's expression. The constitutional layer is the Redeemer framework's core governance provisions, the concurrent authorization requirements structure, the Commons Governance Protocol's principles, the conflict resolution mechanisms architecture, the Classified Archives Access Authorization Protocol, and the amendment process's supermajority threshold. The constitutional layer can be modified by the amendment process, but the amendment process's supermajority threshold ensures that the modification requires the consensus that the constitutional stability's purpose demands. The constitutional layer's provisions apply across the full permanent resident population's governance participation, and the modification of provisions that affect the entire population's governance rights requires the broad consensus that a simple majority's endorsement cannot adequately represent. The constitutional layer is the operating system's core services, the fundamental resource allocation algorithms, the process scheduling's priority framework, the memory management's protection boundaries. These can be updated. The operating system's version updates modify the core services, but the update process requires the backward compatibility verification and the stability testing that the application's operational reliability demands. The Redeemer framework's amendment process is the governance equivalent of the operating system's version update process, careful, deliberate, backward compatible where possible, and subject to the broad consensus verification that the constitutional layer's stability requires. The regulatory layer is the Governance Council's ordinary legislative function, the specific policy provisions, the specific resource allocation decisions, the specific operational standards that the permanent resident community's collective judgment produces through the Redeemer framework's deliberative processes within the constitutional layer's constraints. The regulatory layer changes frequently. The Governance Council's regular sessions produce the policy evolution that the Principality's changing circumstances require, and the changes require only the simple majority that the specific policy's deliberative process produces. The regulatory layer is the application, the specific programs that the governance community chooses to run on the Redeemer framework's operating system, within the constitutional layer's constraints, in service of the foundational layer's primary objectives. The application changes with the community's evolving judgment. The operating system constrains and enables the application's operation. The foundational layer specifies the application's purpose. The operational layer is the Terraform operator's concurrent authorization function, the real-time governance decision that the formation's conditions require at the timescale that the deliberative processes cannot match. The Terraform operator's concurrent authorization is not the Governance Council's deliberative process, it is the operating system's interrupt handler, the provision for the real-time event that cannot wait for the scheduled deliberative process's next session. The operational layer's relationship to the constitutional layer is the concurrent authorization requirements specification. The Terraform operator's concurrent authorization operates within the constitutional layer's constraints, cannot override the foundational layer's primary objectives, and is subject to the Governance Council's retrospective review at the next session. The interrupt handler operates at the operating system's privilege level but cannot modify the kernel. The Terraform operator operates at the governance's professional authority but cannot modify the constitutional framework. The deliberative process. The Redeemer framework's deliberative process is the governance operating system's primary decision-making mechanism, the structured process through which the permanent resident community's collective judgment is formed, expressed, and converted into the governance decisions that the regulatory layer specifies. The deliberative process is not the surface world's parliamentary debate, the adversarial format where competing interest factions make arguments for the positions that their constituent interests support and the majority's composition determines which position the legislature adopts. The adversarial format's assumption is that the legitimate governance outcome is the majority coalition's preferred position, and that the deliberative process's function is to determine which coalition commands the majority. Redeemer's deliberative process assumes a different governance objective. The legitimate governance outcome is the decision that best serves the foundational layer's primary objectives given the full range of relevant information that the community's diverse perspectives and expertise bring to the deliberation. The deliberative process's function is not to determine which coalition commands the majority, it is to produce the collective judgment that the community's full range of perspectives and expertise generates when the deliberation structure creates the conditions for the perspectives and expertise to be heard, evaluated, and synthesized into the decision that best serves the primary objectives. The conditions that Redeemer's deliberative process creates for the perspectives and expertise to be heard, evaluated, and synthesized are: the information disclosure requirement. The deliberative process requires the full disclosure of all relevant information that the governance decisions assessment demands, to all governance participants whose perspective and expertise are relevant to the decision's evaluation. The Classified Archives Access Authorization Protocol is the information disclosure requirements exception. The information whose strategic protection the legal strategy's effectiveness demands is classified at the access level that the classification's strategic necessity specifies, rather than disclosed to the full governance participation. The Expertise Recognition Protocol. The deliberative process weights the contributions of participants with relevant expertise more heavily in the technical assessment dimensions of the governance decision than the contributions of participants without the relevant expertise. This is not the technocracy that substitutes expert judgment for democratic participation. The governance decision's final determination requires the community's collective judgment, not the expert's unilateral assessment. But the technical assessment that informs the community's collective judgment, the Terraform Operator's Formation Condition Assessment, the Research Commons Scientific Evaluation, the Legal Counsel's Legal Strategy Assessment, receives the recognition that the expertise's relevance to the specific decision dimension deserves. The dissent documentation requirement. The deliberative process requires the formal documentation of dissenting perspectives in the governance record, including the specific objections that the dissenting perspective raises and the specific information that the dissenting perspective identifies as inadequately addressed in the majority judgment's reasoning. The dissent documentation serves the governance record's retrospective review function. The documentation of what the dissenting perspective argued at the time of the decision is the historical record that the retrospective review uses to assess whether the decision's outcome confirmed or disconfirmed the majority judgment's reasoning. The Retrospective Review Protocol. The Governance Council reviews the previous governance cycle's major decisions in the current cycle's opening sessions, assessing the decision's outcomes against the outcomes that the deliberative process's reasoning predicted and identifying the reasoning errors that the outcome disconfirmation reveals. The retrospective review is the governance operating system's error correction mechanism, the process that identifies the deliberative process's reasoning failures and updates the decision-making framework's informational inputs and expertise recognition protocols to reduce the reasoning failures' recurrence. The four conditions together constitute the deliberative process's design: the information disclosure that equips the decision with the relevant information, the expertise recognition that applies the relevant expertise to the technical assessment, the dissent documentation that preserves the alternative reasoning for retrospective review, and the retrospective review that learns from the decision's outcomes and updates the decision-making framework. The deliberative process is the governance architecture's learning mechanism, the institutional structure that produces decisions whose quality improves across the governance cycles as the retrospective review's learning accumulates. The concurrent authorization structure. The concurrent authorization is Redeemer's most distinctive governance provision and the one that most directly expresses the founding charter's formation-first governance philosophy, the requirement that the Terraform operator's professional judgment concur with the Governance Council's deliberative decision before the decision takes effect in the formation's management. The concurrent authorization is not the veto in the separation of powers sense. The Terraform operator cannot prevent the Governance Council's decision from being implemented by refusing authorization. The Terraform operator's refusal triggers the Conflict Resolution Protocol, whose process produces either the revised decision that the Terraform operator's professional assessment can authorize or the Governance Council's override of the Terraform operator's professional assessment with the supermajority vote that the constitutional layer's conflict resolution specification requires. The concurrent authorization's function is the systematic integration of the formation's current condition into every governance decision that affects the formation's management. The Terraform operator's professional judgment about the formation's current geological, biological, and ecological condition is the concurrent authorization's informational input, and the governance decision that the concurrent authorization requirement structures must be compatible with the formation's current condition as the Terraform operator's professional assessment characterizes it. The concurrent authorization requirement applies to every governance decision in the regulatory layer that affects the formation's management: the expansion program's deployment decision, the stocking algorithm's production quota, the visitor management's ecological impact budget allocation, the maintenance protocol's cleaning cycle specification, and the biological management protocol species introduction assessment. The full range of decisions that the formation's management requires is subject to the Terraform operator's concurrent authorization, because the full range of decisions that the formation's management requires must be compatible with the formation's current condition. The concurrent authorization requirement is the governance architecture's formation-first expression. The formation's condition is always the governance decision's primary constraint, and the Terraform operator's professional judgment is the constraint's real-time expression. The Governance Council cannot decide to exceed the formation's ecological carrying capacity by any deliberative process that Redeemer specifies, because the terraform operator's concurrent authorization of such a decision would require the terraform operator to professionally certify that the formation's current condition supports the capacity exceedance, a certification that the terraform operator's professional ethics prohibit when the formation's condition indicators do not support it. The concurrent authorization's professional ethics protection is the governance architecture's most important corruption prevention mechanism. The terraform operator who authorizes a decision that exceeds the formation's ecological carrying capacity for the commercial return optimization's benefit is a terraform operator whose professional conduct is subject to the certification body's review and the Redeemer Framework's conflict of interest protocol. The professional consequence is the certification revocation and the concurrent authorization authority's loss, a consequence that the terraform operator's professional incentives treat as more significant than the commercial benefit that the formation's exceedance would produce. The professional consequence's effectiveness depends on the certification body's integrity and the conflict of interest protocol's genuine application. Both are the Redeemer Framework's institutional provisions that the Governance Council's oversight maintains, the certification body's independence from the commercial interests that the production quotas level affects, and the conflict of interest protocol's consistent application regardless of the authority's institutional convenience. The Commons Governance Protocol. The Commons Governance Protocol is Redeemer's most elaborated governance provision, the specific rules and processes through which the shared resources, the freshwater zone's biological community, the research dataset's intellectual property, the crystal tube network's infrastructure, and the expansion reserve's accumulated capital, are managed as commons assets whose governance the permanent resident community's collective judgment determines rather than the market mechanism's price signal or the founding shareholders' proprietary interest. The Commons Governance Protocol's fundamental principle is the founding charter's commons ownership principle. The shared resources that the civilization's habitation of the formation produces are held in common by the permanent resident community as a collective, not by the founding shareholders as proprietors or by any individual community member as private property. The Commons Governance Protocol specific rules implement this principle at the operational level of each specific shared resources management decision. The research dataset's commons governance is the most legally complex implementation. The intellectual property that the research commons produces, the biological protocols, the engineering standards, the longitudinal data's derived analyses, is held in common at the principality's institutional level rather than at the individual researcher's personal level or the founding shareholder's proprietary level. The Commons Governance Protocol's research licensing terms specify the conditions under which the research commons intellectual property is made available to the surface world's research institutions, conditions that maximize the scientific value that the dataset's availability produces for the research community rather than the royalty income that the proprietary licensing's exclusivity would maximize for the founding shareholders. The ecological commons governance is the most operationally intensive implementation. The freshwater zone's biological community, the passage network's water chemistry, and the cenote's geological substrate are managed by the Commons Governance Protocol's zone designation system, the stocking algorithm's quota management, and the terraform operator's concurrent authorization, the three-level governance structure whose operation the Aquatic Commons chapter documented in the ecological management's operational detail. The infrastructure commons governance is the most financially significant implementation. The crystal tube network's physical infrastructure, the coordinating system's compute infrastructure, and the expansion reserve's accumulated capital are the commons assets whose governance the Network Governance Council's decisions determine, within the constitutional layers constraints that protect the infrastructure commons from the commercial interest optimization that would convert the commons assets into the private property whose value extraction the founding shareholders' return structure optimizes at the commons expense. The infrastructure commons governance is the expansion program's financial foundation. The expansion reserves deployment decisions, which cenote installations receive the next capital deployment, at what installation configuration, under what timeline, are the Network Governance Council's deliberative decisions within the Redeemer Framework's Commons Governance Protocol's constraints. The founding shareholders' return structure participates in the expansion reserve's deployment decisions through the expansion council seat that the founding charter's governance architecture specifies, but the expansion council seat's influence is bounded by the Commons Governance Protocol's provisions that prevent the founding shareholders' commercial return optimization from overriding the primary governance objectives that the expansion reserve's deployment serves. The conflict resolution mechanism. Every governance system produces conflicts, the competing interests, the disputed facts, the incompatible interpretations of the rules that the governance decisions generate among the governance participants. The conflict resolution mechanism is the governance operating system's most important reliability provision, the institutional process that resolves the conflicts without the governance system's failure, without the political crisis that unresolved conflicts produce in the surface world's governance systems whose conflict resolution mechanisms are inadequate to the conflict's frequency or intensity. Redeemer's conflict resolution mechanism is a tiered process whose tier selection reflects the conflict's character. The interest conflict, the factual dispute, and the rule interpretation dispute each require different resolution processes whose appropriate tier the conflict's categorization determines. The interest conflict, the competing claims of different governance participants to the same resource or the same decision authority, is resolved by the deliberative process's structured negotiation. The Redeem Framework's mediation protocol brings the competing interest parties into the facilitated dialogue whose outcome is either the negotiated agreement that both parties accept or the principled compromise that the mediator's assessment of the interest's relative weight in the governance framework's primary objective prioritization produces. The mediation protocol's mediator is the Redeem Framework's designated neutral, not the Governance Council's member whose election represents one of the competing interests, not the founding shareholders' representative whose commercial interest the conflict may be affecting, but the permanent resident community member whose governance participation history demonstrates the impartiality and the governance philosophy understanding that the mediation role requires. The mediator's designation is the legal committee's appointment authority, subject to the Governance Council's confirmation. The factual dispute, the disagreement about the formation's current condition, the biological community's ecological health, or the governance record's historical documentation, is resolved by the coordinating system's data record and the terraform operator's professional assessment. The digital twin's formation intelligence record is the authoritative factual reference for the formation's current condition and historical documentation, and the terraform operator's professional assessment is the authoritative expert interpretation of the factual record's implications for the governance decision's formation-related dimensions. The factual disputes resolution mechanism is the governance architecture's most technically specific provision. The coordinating system's data record resolves the factual dispute by reference to the authenticated, tamper-evident, continuously generated data that the monitoring network produces independently of the competing interests' selective data presentations. The factual dispute that persists after the coordinating system's data record has been presented is not a factual dispute, it is an interest conflict dressed in factual language, and the mediation protocol's interest conflict resolution process is the appropriate resolution mechanism. The rule interpretation dispute, the disagreement about what the Redeem Framework's constitutional provisions mean in the specific governance context that has produced the dispute, is resolved by the constitutional review process, the legal committee's interpretation of the constitutional provisions' meaning in the specific context, subject to the Governance Council's review and the supermajority's ability to produce the constitutional amendment that the interpretation's inadequacy demonstrates is required. The tiered conflict resolution mechanism is the governance architecture's reliability provision. The conflicts that the governance system generates are resolved within the governance system's processes rather than accumulating as the unresolved tensions that eventually produce the political crisis that overwhelms the governance system. The governance system that has no conflict resolution mechanism for every conflict type is the governance system that political crises eventually destroy. Redeemer's tiered mechanism is the reliability engineering applied to the governance operating system, the provision that the system will continue operating despite the conflicts that governance inevitably generates. The Redeemer platform. The Redeemer Framework's physical implementation is the Redeemer platform, the software system that the coordinating system's governance management layer implements as the digital infrastructure through which the deliberative processes, the concurrent authorization, the conflict resolution, and the Commons governance protocol operate as the Principality's daily governance practice. The Redeemer platform is not the governance is the permanent resident community's collective judgment and the terraform operator's professional assessment and the legal counsel's legal strategy and the research commons scientific contribution. The Redeemer platform is the digital infrastructure that the governance operates through, the interface through which the deliberative process's participants contribute their perspectives, the system through which the concurrent authorizations authentication and logging occur, the database in which the governance records decisions and the classified archives content are maintained, and the algorithm through which the Commons governance protocol's quota calculations and distribution allocations are computed. The Redeemer platform security architecture is the governance operating system's most technically demanding implementation. The deliberative process's information disclosure, the classified archives access authorization, and the governance records tamper-evident authentication all require security provisions whose technical implementation the founding charter's governance design team specified at the evidentiary standard that the legal proceedings authentication requirements demand. The biometric authentication that the classified archives access authorization requires is the Redeemer platform's most legally significant security provision. The legal committee's member who accesses the classified archive is biometrically authenticated before the access is granted, and the access event is logged in the tamper-evident record that the governance records Commons governance archive maintains. The access log is the classified archives accountability provision, the record that the Governance Council's oversight review uses to confirm that the classified archives access has been limited to the legal committee's authorized members and has not been provided to unauthorized parties by any means that the access log would document. The Redeemer platform's governance management layer is the coordinating system's most governance-specific computational function, the deliberative process scheduling, the concurrent authorization logging, the conflict resolution protocol tracking, and the Commons governance quota calculations that the governance operating system's daily operation requires. The governance management layer operates in the coordinating system's classical neural compute architecture alongside the production management, the biological monitoring, and the maintenance scheduling that the coordinating system's other management layers provide. The governance management layer's computational demands are modest relative to the production management and the biological monitoring. The deliberative processes information processing is primarily the structured communication and the document management that the governance participants' contributions require, not the real-time sensor data processing and the predictive model updating that the biological monitoring's continuous operation demands. The governance management layer's modest computational demand reflects the governance operating system's functional relationship to the applications it supports. The operating system enables the application's operation but does not perform the application's computational work. Redeemer civilizational technology. The Founding Charter's governance design team specified Redeemer as the Principality's governance operating system not only as the practical institutional provision for the Cenote installation's governance requirements but as the prototype for a class of governance architecture that the civilizational transition the Founding Charter anticipates will require. The civilizational transition is the shift from the industrial civilization's governance systems, the evolved systems calibrated to the terrestrial ontology's property framework and the demographic scale's representative democracy, to the governance systems that the inhabited geological formations require, systems calibrated to the three-dimensional formation's ecological constraints, the permanent resident community's voluntary civilizational commitment, and the thousand-year design lives. Temporal horizon. Redeemer's four-layer constitutional architecture, its concurrent authorization structure, its commons governance protocol, and its deliberative process are the design elements that the Founding Charter's governance design team identified as necessary for the inhabited geological formations governance across the temporal span that the aquaforming doctrine's thousand-year commitment requires. The surface world's governance system's evolved design was not built for this temporal span or for the ecological constraints or for the voluntary civilizational commitment that the inhabited geological formations governance requires. Redeemer is the designed alternative, the governance architecture that was specified for these requirements rather than evolved from the historical contingencies that the surface world's governance systems accumulated. The design's quality depends on the design team's understanding of the requirements, the ecological constraints, the temporal horizon, the voluntary commitment's fragility, and the commercial pressure's inevitable challenge to the primary governance objective's primacy. The design team's understanding of the requirements was derived from the Amazon Lessons negative case, from the surface world's governance failure literature that the Research Commons social science program has compiled, from the Commons governance theory's empirical evidence about which governance architectures sustain commons resources across multi-generational timescales, and from the Founding Charter's primary governance objective specification that the aquaforming doctrine provides as the governance philosophy's foundation. Redeemer is not a perfect governance system. It is the best governance system that the Founding Charter's design team could specify for the inhabited geological formations requirements at the founding moment's knowledge level. The Redeemer platform's version history, the governance records documentation of the deliberative processes that have produced the constitutional amendments and the regulatory revisions since the founding installation's first governance session, is the governance design's learning record, the evidence of where the founding specification was correct and where the operations experience has revealed the specification's inadequacy. The governance system that learns from its operation is the governance system that improves across the governance cycles. Redeemer is designed to learn, the retrospective review protocol produces the learning, the amendment process incorporates the learning into the constitutional update, and the regulatory layer's policy evolution applies the learning to the operational decisions. Redeemer is the governance operating system. The permanent resident community's collective judgment is the application. The formation is the environment. The 1,000 years are the runtime. The governance is running. The formation is being managed. The civilization is inside the gap. The governance makes the inside viable for the duration that the formation can sustain. Cross-references, Part 8, Section A, CH4, From Resort to Municipality, Part 8, Section B, CH7, The Aquatic Commons, Part 9, CH1, The Legal Gap, Part 9, CH2, Floating Title and the Habitation Record, Part 9, CH3, Strategic Duplicity, Part 9, CH5, The Commons Ownership Principle, Part 9, CH6, Distributed Sanctuary, Part 10, CH6, ASI as co-creating partner, Part 12, CH5, Sans a priori. For Redeemer Platform Technical Specification and Governance Management Layer Computational Architecture, see Appendix H, Governance Operations Manual. For four-layer constitutional architecture amendment process and supermajority threshold specification, see Appendix H, Governance Operations Manual. For concurrent authorization logging protocol and Terraform operator professional ethics certification requirement, see Appendix H, Governance Operations Manual. For deliberative process information disclosure requirement and expertise recognition protocol specification, see Appendix H, Governance Operations Manual. For conflict resolution tiered process and mediator designation authority specification, see Appendix H, Governance Operations Manual. For Commons Governance Protocol Commons Ownership Principle Legal Implementation, see Appendix E, Economic Architecture, and Appendix H, Governance Operations Manual. Discussion about this episode. Pipe Dream Part 7 updated. 22 hours ago, MXTM aka Pirate 1 or VJ Tsunami X. Sueño de Tuberia Part 5. July 17, MXTM aka.
Chapter 5. The Commons Ownership Principle. Ownership is the surface world's most fundamental economic concept, and its most contested political one. The economic tradition that the market economy's development has produced treats ownership as the foundational institution from which the market's efficiency-generating properties derive. The owner who bears the consequence of resource mismanagement has the incentive to avoid it. The owner who captures the benefit of resource improvement has the incentive to invest in it. The owner who can transfer the resource to whoever values it most highly has the incentive to trade it, and the aggregate of these individual incentives, coordinated through the price system, produces the efficient allocation that the market economy's theoretical case presents as the economic system's primary virtue. The political tradition that the market economy's critique has generated treats ownership as the primary institution of the economic inequality that the market economy produces. The owner who controls the production process determines its conditions. The non-owner who depends on the production process for income has no alternative but to accept the conditions the owner determines. And the aggregate of these power relationships, coordinated through the labor market's wage determination, produces the inequality that the market economy's critics present as the economic system's primary vice. Both traditions are engaging with the same institution from different angles, one emphasizing the efficiency-generating properties of individual incentives that ownership produces, the other emphasizing the power relationships and distributional consequences that ownership concentrates. Both are partially right. The ownership institution does generate the efficiency-producing incentives that the economic tradition identifies, and it does concentrate the power relationships and distributional consequences that the political tradition criticizes. The Founding Charter's Commons Ownership Principle is not a refutation of either tradition. It is the recognition that the cenote formation's specific ecological, geological, and temporal character produces a class of resources whose efficient management is not served by individual ownership and whose distributional consequences are not compatible with the commercial privatization that the surface world's market economy's default institutional form would impose. The Commons Ownership Principle specifies the conditions under which the resource management that the formation's conditions require must be organized as commons governance rather than as private ownership, and establishes the institutional framework through which the commons governance produces the management outcomes that both the formation's ecological integrity and the permanent resident community's long-term well-being require. The three categories of commons. The Founding Charter's Commons Ownership Principle identifies three categories of formation resources that the commons governance framework covers. The first category is the ecological commons, the living biological community of the freshwater zone, the passage network's water chemistry, and the geological substrate, whose integrated function constitutes the formation's ecological productivity. The ecological commons is commons because the biological community's ecological function is indivisible. The Bodo's behavioral ecology, the synthetic reef's succession dynamics, the aquifer's water chemistry, and the lithocrustacean's geological stewardship are not separable functions that individual owners can manage independently without their management decisions affecting the aggregate ecological system's function. The individual owner of the Bodo population's management right would make Bodo management decisions that optimize the Bodo population's value to the owner, which might include the behavioral conditioning that produces the most spectacular tourist encounter rather than the undisturbed ecological behavior that the biological community's apex predator function requires. The individual owner of the synthetic reef's succession management right would make succession decisions that optimize the reef's optical appeal to the tourist rather than the biological community's mid-succession ecological composition that the crystal tube standards crystal specification requires. The ecological functions that the formation's biological community performs are not separable into individual ownership units, whose separate optimization produces the aggregate ecological function's maintenance. The aggregate ecological function requires the integrated management that the commons governance framework provides, the coordinating system's biological management protocol applying the ecological management philosophy's integrated assessment rather than the individual ownership unit's separate optimization. The second category is the intellectual commons, The research dataset, the biological protocols, the engineering standards, and the governance innovations that the civilization's formation and habitation has produced across the design life's accumulation. The intellectual commons is commons because the knowledge that the formations and habitation generates is the product of the collective intelligence that the full permanent resident community's cognitive diversity contributes to. The research commons scientific output is not the individual researcher's solitary production. It is the collaborative product of the cross-disciplinary engagement that the formation's unique conditions promote among the biologists, the geologists, the engineers, the governance specialists, and the medical researchers whose individual expertise the formation's specific character requires simultaneously. The individual ownership of the research dataset would be the ownership of the collective intelligence's product by the individual whose name appears on the research protocol's principal investigator line. The reduction of the collaborative product to the individual contribution that the intellectual property system's authorship convention was developed for the single inventor's solitary production rather than for the cross-disciplinary collective's integrated research program. The research commons produces knowledge that the formations and habitation requires to be openly shared. The biological protocol whose commons access allows other formations' biological communities to benefit from the founding formation's ecological management experience. The engineering standard whose commons access allows other installations' construction programs to benefit from the founding installation's construction efficiency improvements, and the governance innovation whose commons access allows other inhabited geological formations to benefit from the principality's governance architecture's development. The knowledge that the formations and habitation generates is most valuable when it is most widely accessible. When the research community's full engagement with the dataset produces the scientific output that the individual installation scientists alone cannot produce. When the engineering standards global application across comparable geological formations produces the construction efficiency improvements that the single installation's learning curve cannot accumulate without the global network's combined experience. The third category is the infrastructure commons, the crystal tube network's physical infrastructure, the coordinating system's compute infrastructure, the expansion reserve's accumulated capital, and the digital twin's formation intelligence record. The infrastructure commons is commons because the infrastructure's function is the entire permanent resident community's foundational operating environment. The crystal tube network is not an asset that any individual community member can use without affecting the other community members' use, and the asset's management decisions affect all community members' conditions equally. The individual ownership of the crystal tube network would be the ownership of the community's operating environment by the individual whose commercial interest in the network's use fees would be served by the fee maximization rather than the community's operational requirements satisfaction. The individual ownership of the expansion reserve would be the ownership of the community's investment capital by the individual whose investment return optimization would be served by the capital's deployment in the highest short-term return application rather than the expansion program's long-horizon formation management that the founding charter's investment thesis specifies. The infrastructure whose function is the entire community's operational foundation must be governed by the community as a whole rather than by the individual whose ownership would optimize the infrastructure's function for the individual's benefit at the community's expense. The commons ownership's relationship to the founding shareholders. The founding shareholders' relationship to the commons ownership principle is the founding charter's most carefully negotiated economic provision. The founding shareholders provided the capital that built the infrastructure commons, developed the intellectual commons foundational research programs, and established the ecological commons management architecture. The founding shareholders' capital contribution is not converted into the commons by the commons ownership principle without acknowledgement of the contribution's significance or without the economic return structure that the contribution deserves. The commons ownership principle does not dispossess the founding shareholders. It specifies the conditions under which the founding shareholders' capital contribution entitles the founding shareholders to participation in the commons management governance and to the economic return structure that the founding charter's expansion council provisions establish. The founding shareholders' governance participation is the expansion council seat. The Governance Council's Standing Committee, whose specific mandate is the expansion reserves deployment decision oversight, the founding shareholders' economic interests protection within the Commons governance framework's primary objective constraints, and the commercial return optimization's representation in the Governance Council's deliberative processes at the level that the founding charter's economic architecture permits. The Expansion Council's governance participation is bounded by the constitutional layer's primary objective constraints. The founding shareholders' Expansion Council representation cannot vote to deploy the expansion reserve in applications that the ecological integrity constraint prohibits, cannot authorize the Research Commons licensing terms that the Commons Governance Protocol's scientific value maximization standard prohibits, and cannot override the concurrent authorization requirement that the Terraform operator's professional assessment requires for every formation management decision. The founding shareholders' economic return structure is the Commons ownership principle's most complex provision, the return structure that the founding charter's economics chapter documents, the participation in the network values growth across the design life rather than the proprietary asset sale event liquidation, is the translation of the founding shareholders' capital contribution into the economic return format that the Commons ownership's institutional framework accommodates. The proprietary ownership structure's conventional return, the dividend from the proprietary asset's annual cash flow, the capital gain from the proprietary asset sale, is not available in the Commons ownership framework because the Commons assets cash flow is governed by the Commons Governance Protocol rather than the founding shareholders' dividend decision. And the Commons asset sale is prohibited by the Commons ownership principle rather than the market's transaction mechanism. The network value participation return is the alternative that the founding charter's economics chapter develops as the translation. The founding shareholders' return is not the proprietary assets cash flow appropriation but the participation in the Commons long-term value growth that the Commons governance's effective management produces. The return is not the extraction of value from the Commons, but the participation in the value that the Commons creates, a fundamental distinction in the economic relationship between the capital contributor and the managed Commons that the founding charter's economics architecture was specifically designed to produce. The distinction's practical expression is the Expansion Council's governance mandate. The founding shareholders' representative on the Expansion Council is advancing the founding shareholders' economic interest by advocating for the expansion reserves deployment in applications that maximize the network value's long-term growth rather than the short-term cash flow extraction that the proprietary ownership structure's dividend maximization would require. The Commons ownership's institutional framework aligns the founding shareholders' economic interest with the network value's long-term growth rather than the short-term extraction. Not because the founding shareholders are altruistic, but because the Commons ownership principle has structured the return in a way that makes the long-term growth the founding shareholders' economic incentive rather than the short-term extraction. The anti-enclosure provisions. The Commons ownership principle's most operationally demanding provisions are the anti-enclosure measures, the specific institutional protections that prevent the Commons assets from being enclosed, converted to private ownership, by the mechanisms that the surface world's political economy has historically used to convert common pool resources into private property. The historical enclosure mechanisms that the founding charter's anti-enclosure provisions specifically address are the legislative enclosure, the governance process that modifies the Commons ownership principle's constitutional status through the amendment process, converting the Commons assets to private ownership through the constitutional revision rather than through the market transaction. The anti-enclosure protection is the foundational layer's unmodifiable status for the Commons ownership principle. The Commons ownership principle is not a regulatory layer provision whose modification the Governance Council's ordinary legislative function can produce. It is a constitutional layer provision whose modification requires the supermajority that the constitutional amendment process specifies. And the founding charter's specification of the Commons ownership principle as a near-foundational constitutional provision whose modification requires the most demanding supermajority makes the legislative enclosure practically impossible within the governance architecture's institutional structure. The commercial enclosure, the market transaction that converts the Commons asset to private ownership through the sale or the long-term lease that effectively transfers the ownership rights while maintaining the nominal Commons status. The anti-enclosure protection is the inalienability provision. The Commons assets are inalienable. They cannot be sold, mortgaged, pledged as collateral, or transferred to any private ownership form through any market transaction that the Redeemer Framework's Commons Governance Protocol does not specifically authorize as compatible with the Commons Ownership Principles requirements. The inalienability provision's practical expression is the Research Commons intellectual property licensing structure. The Research Commons intellectual property can be licensed, its use rights transferred to the licensee for the specified purposes and the specified duration, but the intellectual property itself cannot be sold to the licensee as the licensee's proprietary asset. The licensing transfers the use right. The ownership remains in the commons. The licensee can use the research protocol for the specified purposes during the license period. The licensee cannot claim the research protocol as the licensee's intellectual property or prevent other licensees from receiving comparable licenses. The regulatory enclosure. The host state's regulatory framework that extends to cover the commons assets management in ways that substitute the host state's regulatory authority for the Commons Governance Protocol's commons governance. The anti-enclosure protection is the strategic duplicity's outward alignment management. The Commons Governance Protocol's management of the commons assets is the Principality's internal governance that the Principality Deals Recognition Framework identifies as within the Principality's self-governance scope, not the host state's regulatory framework's domain. The regulatory enclosure's risk is the most sophisticated and the most difficult to protect against because the host state's regulatory authority is legitimate in the domains that the Principality Deals Recognition Framework specifies as the host state's reserved jurisdiction. The anti-enclosure protection requires the Principality Deals negotiating history's careful specification of the reserved jurisdiction's boundaries to ensure that the regulatory enclosure mechanism, the extension of the host state's regulatory authority to the commons assets management, cannot proceed through the legitimate exercise of the reserved jurisdiction without exceeding the Principality Deals negotiated boundaries. The regulatory enclosure protection is the strategic duplicity's most practically demanding application. The outward alignment with a host state's regulatory framework must be genuine and complete within the Principality Deals negotiated boundaries, while the Commons Governance Protocol's management of the commons assets within the Principality's self-governance scope must be clearly and consistently distinguished from the host state's reserved jurisdiction's domain. The boundaries clarity is the regulatory enclosure protection's most important practical provision. The ambiguity that would allow the host state's regulatory authority to extend gradually into the Commons Governance Protocol's domain is the anti-enclosure provision's primary vulnerability. The commons and the market. The commons ownership principle is not an anti-market provision. The commons assets generate market interactions. The research commons licensing income from the pharmaceutical company's research applications. The expansion reserves deployment capital from the tourism program's market-priced enrollment fees, and the aquaculture production's distribution through the regional food commons pricing protocol that the market's price signal informs but does not solely determine. The market is present in the Principality's economic life. The commons ownership principle specifies the conditions under which the market's allocation mechanism is the appropriate governance instrument and the conditions under which the commons governance protocol's collective judgment is required instead. The market's allocation mechanism is appropriate when the resource being allocated is sufficiently divisible into individual units whose transfer does not affect the non-transferred unit's function. The transactions parties bear the full consequences of the transfer rather than externalizing consequences to non-transacting third parties. And the time horizon of the transaction is compatible with the market's price signal's ability to reflect the resource's long-term value rather than only the current period's demand. The formation's ecological commons fails all three conditions. The biological community's ecological function is indivisible. The extraction from the commons externalizes consequences to the entire biological community rather than bearing them solely within the transaction. And the ecological community's recovery timescale from extraction pressure exceeds the market's price signal's ability to reflect the long-term value that the sustainable extraction rate preserves. The research commons intellectual commons partially meets the conditions. The intellectual property's use right is divisible. Different licensees can use the same protocol simultaneously without the use affecting each other's use. The licensing transactions parties bear the license fee without externalizing consequences to third parties, but the time horizon condition fails. The research commons' long-term scientific credibility that the open access licensing builds is not captured by the proprietary licensing's short-term royalty maximization's price signal. The infrastructure commons fails the first and third conditions. The crystal tube network's capacity is not infinitely divisible among simultaneous users. The maglev transit corridor's physical constraints limit the simultaneous pod population that the guide rail can support. And the infrastructure's replacement cost reflects the 1,000-year design life's long-term value that the market's current period demand signal cannot adequately reflect. The Commons Governance Protocol's collective judgment is required for the conditions where the market's allocation mechanism fails. The market is permitted where the conditions are met. The Commons Governance Protocol specifies the boundary. The boundary is the Commons ownership principle's most practically important specification, not the categorical rejection of the market, but the conditional engagement with the market where the market's efficiency-generating properties apply, and the categorical rejection of the market where the market's efficiency-generating properties fail, and the Commons governance's collective judgment is required for the management outcome that both the formation's ecological integrity and the permanent resident community's long-term well-being require. The Commons and Innovation. The intellectual commons' most contested provision in the Founding Charter's governance design process was the innovation incentive. The conventional intellectual property system's justification for the proprietary ownership of intellectual property is the innovation incentive. The exclusive right to exploit the intellectual property commercially provides the inventor with a return that compensates for the research investment and motivates the next research investment. The Commons ownership principle's research licensing structure does not provide exclusive commercial exploitation rights. The research protocol is licensed to multiple licensees simultaneously under terms that do not exclude competitors. The conventional intellectual property system's innovation incentive, the exclusive commercial exploitation rights monopoly return, is not available to the research commons scientific producers. The Research Commons Innovation Incentive is the academic prestige and the scientific contribution that the published research records recognition provides. The researcher whose protocol is widely licensed produces the most significant scientific contribution, which generates the most significant academic recognition, which attracts the most significant research collaboration, which produces the next most significant scientific contribution. The innovation incentive in the Research Commons is the recognition economy's incentive rather than the monopoly returns financial incentive. The recognition economy's incentive is the appropriate incentive structure for the formation's research context. The researchers who are drawn to the Research Commons scientific program are researchers for whom the formation's unique conditions, the longitudinal dataset's unprecedented scope, and the cross-disciplinary collaboration that the cenote installation's permanent resident community provides are the research program's primary attractions. These researchers are not drawn primarily by the financial incentive that the proprietary licensing's exclusive exploitation right would provide. They are drawn by the scientific opportunity that the Commons research program's unique conditions create. The Commons Research Program's scientific opportunity is the Research Commons' competitive advantage over the proprietary research program's financial incentive. The researcher, who can study the formation's biological community across the longitudinal dataset's full temporal span, in unique conditions that no surface world research institution can replicate, in collaboration with the cross-disciplinary community that the permanent resident's diverse expertise produces, this researcher has access to a scientific opportunity that no proprietary research program's financial return can purchase. The Commons ownership principle attracts the scientific community whose primary motivation is the scientific opportunity rather than the financial return, and the scientific community whose primary motivation is the scientific opportunity produces the research output whose quality the Research Commons scientific contribution requires. The Commons ownership principle is not sacrificing the innovation incentive. It is identifying the innovation incentive that is most productive for the Research Commons' specific scientific context and aligning the intellectual commons institutional structure with that specific incentive. The Research Commons Innovation Incentive is the scientific community's recognition that the Commons ownership principle produces as the appropriate innovation incentive for the formation's research context. The Commons owns the knowledge. The recognition economy rewards the knowledge's production. The reward attracts the researchers whose primary motivation is the scientific opportunity. The scientific opportunity produces the research output. The research output expands the commons. The expanding commons generates the increasing recognition that attracts the next researchers. The commons ownership is the innovation engine. The intellectual property system's monopoly right would lock the engine in the single institution's proprietary portfolio rather than releasing it into the scientific community's expanding engagement that the commons access produces. The commons as civilizational inheritance. The surface world's most consequential commons are the civilization's civilizational inheritances, the mathematical knowledge accumulated across millennia of mathematical practice, the literary tradition that every subsequent generation of writers builds on and modifies, the common law's precedent that the legal system's development has accumulated across centuries of judicial reasoning, and the scientific knowledge that the peer review tradition has developed and verified across the scientific community's collaborative engagement. These civilizational inheritances are commons not because any governance framework specifies them as commons, but because their nature, the indivisibility of the knowledge from the cumulative human intelligence that produced it, the impossibility of identifying the specific individual contribution that any particular element of the inheritance represents, makes the private ownership claim meaningless. No individual owns the Pythagorean theorem. No individual owns the common law's negligence doctrine. No individual owns the germ theory of disease. These are the human civilization's accumulated knowledge, available to every member of the civilization who has the education to access them. The Founding Charter's commons ownership principle asserts that the cenote formation's ecological knowledge, the formation's geological intelligence, and the governance innovations that the civilization's formation and habitation produces are the same class of civilizational inheritance. The accumulated knowledge of what it means to inhabit a geological formation correctly across the temporal span that the knowledge's generation requires. The knowledge that the civilizational inheritance represents is not the property of the individual researchers, the founding shareholders, or the permanent resident community as a bounded legal entity. It is the property of the civilizational project that the Founding Charter's aquaforming doctrine represents, the understanding that geological formations can be inhabited by human civilizations without being exploited, degraded, or destroyed, and that the specific institutional forms, ecological management protocols, governance architectures, and construction technologies that the Yucatan cenote formation's inhabitation has developed are the knowledge that the next inhabited geological formation will need to benefit from as the civilizational inheritance that the founding formation's experience constitutes. The commons ownership principle's most ambitious specification is the civilizational inheritance's scope. The principality holds the research dataset, the biological protocols, the engineering standards, and the governance innovations in commons for the benefit not only of the permanent resident community's current members, but of the civilizational project's future participants. The comparable geological formations across the world's karst limestone systems that will deploy the living pantries. Replication package. The ocean colony's Ankylan installations that will adapt the crystal tube standards engineering to the submarine access geometry, and the governance frameworks that will adapt Redeemer's constitutional architecture to the specific political and legal contexts of the sovereign territories where comparable geological formations exist. The commons is held for the civilization, not for the community. The civilization's participants are whoever inhabits the geological formations correctly. The principality's current permanent resident community is the first participants. The future inhabited geological formations are the subsequent participants. The civilizational inheritance accumulates across all the participants' contributions. The commons ownership principle is the mechanism through which the civilizational project's knowledge accumulates as a common inheritance rather than fragmenting into the proprietary portfolios that the individual installation's private ownership would produce. The proprietary portfolio's knowledge is the portfolio owner's competitive advantage. The common inheritance's knowledge is the civilization's shared foundation. The civilization that inhabits geological formations correctly does not need competitive advantages between its installations. It needs the shared foundation that makes every subsequent installation more capable, more ecologically integrated, and more governmentally effective than the preceding installation. The commons ownership principle is the shared foundation's institutional guarantee. The guarantee lasts as long as the Commons Governance Protocol's constitutional protection maintains it. The protection lasts as long as the Redeemer Framework's constitutional stability sustains it. The constitutional stability lasts as long as the permanent resident community's governance participation reproduces it across the generational transitions that the design life requires. The commons is what the civilization holds for itself, and for the civilizational project's future, and for the geological formations that accepted the civilization's presence, without requiring the exploitation that the surface world's resource management tradition would have imposed. The geological formations contributed 66 million years of formation. The civilization contributes the management that allows the formation to sustain the civilization. The commons is the knowledge of how to manage correctly, held for everyone who will ever try. Cross-references. Part 8, Section A, Ch. 5, The Economics of Infinite Expansion. Part 8, Section B, Ch. 7, The Aquatic Commons. Part 9, Ch. 1, The Legal Gap. Part 9, Ch. 2, Floating Title and the Habitation Record. Part 9, Ch. 3, Strategic Duplicity. Part 9, Ch. 4, Redeemer as Governance OS. Part 9, Ch. 6, Distributed Sanctuary. Part 12, Ch. 4, Regenerative Industry. Part 12, Ch. 6, Why Pipe Dream Changed Everything. 4 Commons Ownership Principle Constitutional Layer Status and Amendment Supermajority Threshold. See Appendix H, Governance Operations Manual. 4 Founding Shareholders Expansion Council Seat Governance Mandate and Commercial Return Optimization Constitutional Constraint. See Appendix E, Economic Architecture, and Appendix H, Governance Operations Manual. 4 Research Commons Licensing Terms Commons Governance Protocol and Inalienability Provision Specification. See Appendix H, Governance Operations Manual. 4 Anti-Enclosure Provision Specifications and Regulatory Enclosure Protection Protocol. See Appendix H, Governance Operations Manual. 4 Network Value Participation Return Structure and Commons Ownership Economic Translation Framework. See Appendix E, Economic Architecture. Pipe Dream. Part 9, The Sovereign Principality. Chapter 6, Distributed Sanctuary. Sanctuary has a history. The medieval church's sanctuary was the physical space, the cathedral's nave, the chapel's interior, the churchyard's defined perimeter, within which the temporal authority's enforcement power was suspended by the ecclesiastical authority's recognition of the sacred space's immunity. The fugitive who reached the sanctuary's physical threshold was beyond the sheriff's reach, not because the sheriff lacked the physical capacity to enter the building, but because the social and political order that the sheriff's authority expressed recognized the sanctuary's boundary as a constraint on that authority's exercise. The sanctuary's protection was the social recognition of the boundary, not the boundary's physical impregnability. The cathedral doors could be forced. The threshold could be crossed. What the threshold's forcing violated was not physics, but the political order's institutional logic, the logic that the temporal authority's legitimacy depended on respecting the boundaries that the social order's authority map specified as exempt from the temporal power's reach. The sanctuary worked because the social order's authority map included the category and because the enforcement powers holders recognized that the category's violation would delegitimize the authority that the enforcement power served. The modern state has eliminated the sanctuary in the medieval sense. The uniform jurisdiction that the territorial sovereignty doctrine specifies allows no physical space within the national territory to claim exemption from the state's legal authority. The church's physical threshold no longer suspends the sheriff's enforcement power. The fugitive in the cathedral is subject to the same law as the fugitive in the street. The sanctuary category has been abolished by the territorial sovereignty doctrine's jurisdictional uniformity. What the territorial sovereignty doctrine's jurisdictional uniformity has not eliminated is the sanctuary's practical function, the provision of a protected space in which activities that the dominant political order's enforcement power would suppress can proceed without the enforcement power's interference. The practical sanctuary still exists. It has migrated from the physical threshold that the ecclesiastical authority's recognition protected to the jurisdictional gap that the territorial sovereignty doctrine's incomplete coverage produces, the offshore financial center in the small island state's regulatory gap, the encrypted communications channel in the surveillance architecture's technical gap. The international waters in the maritime jurisdiction's coverage gap. The distributed sanctuary is Pipedream's contribution to this migration. The sanctuary, whose protection is not the physical threshold's social recognition, not the jurisdictional gap's regulatory incompleteness, but the geological formation's acoustic physics, the physical property of limestone and water that makes the cenote network's interior acoustically isolated from the surface world's surveillance infrastructure in ways that the territorial sovereignty doctrine's jurisdictional uniformity cannot override because the physics is not subject to jurisdictional authority. Acoustic isolation as governance architecture. The limestone's acoustic properties were established in Part 2's Chapter 2 as the Acoustic Zoning Protocol's foundation, the specific frequencies at which the crystal tube network's communication infrastructure operates, the attenuation rates that the limestone's transmission loss produces at those frequencies, and the total internal reflection geometry that the crystal tube's transparent polymer propagates as the communication system's primary signal pathway. The acoustic isolation's governance architecture significance was noted in Part 2's Chapter 2 as a secondary observation, the communication security that the acoustic physics produces as the crystal tube network's primary function's consequence. Chapter 6 of Part 9 develops what Part 2's Chapter 2 noted only in passing. The acoustic isolation is not merely a communication security consequence. It is a sovereignty architecture, the physical mechanism through which the distributed sanctuary's protection operates, independently of and more reliably than the jurisdictional gap's regulatory incompleteness or the social recognition's political negotiation. The jurisdictional gap's regulatory incompleteness is politically negotiable. The host state can extend its regulatory framework's coverage to the gap by the legislative act, the administrative rulemaking, or the judicial interpretation that the political will and the institutional capacity together produce. The jurisdictional gap's sanctuary closes when the political will to close it reaches the institutional capacity to do so. The acoustic isolation sanctuary does not close when the political will reaches the institutional capacity, because the political will's institutional capacity for closing the acoustic sanctuary requires the physics modification that the political authority cannot legislate. The limestone attenuates the acoustic signal at the rates the material science specifies, regardless of the territorial sovereignty doctrine's jurisdictional uniformity. The crystal tube's total internal reflection geometry propagates the communication signal within the network's interior, regardless of the enforcement power's desire to intercept the communication outside the network. The halocline's density gradient deflects the acoustic transmission between the freshwater and saltwater zones, regardless of the regulatory framework's attempt to surveil both zones simultaneously. The acoustic isolation is not a technological countermeasure to the enforcement power's surveillance, a specific technical system designed to evade a specific surveillance capability. It is the formation's inherent geological character expressed in the acoustic physics that the material science specifies and the enforcement power's political will cannot revise. The sanctuary is distributed across the formation's geological structure, not concentrated at any single physical location that the enforcement power could identify and target, but present wherever the limestone and water that the formation contains produce the acoustic isolation that the material science specifies. The distributed architecture. The distributed sanctuary's distributed architecture is the acoustic isolation's most important property for the sovereignty architecture's purposes. The sanctuary is not in any specific location within the cenote network's extent. It is in the network's entire extent, in every crystal tube section, every gallery ring, every anchored tower, every floating village platform, every intercenote passage, where the limestone and water produce the acoustic isolation that the material science specifies. The enforcement power that targets a specific location within the cenote network as the sanctuary's source has targeted a location where the sanctuary is present but has not targeted the sanctuary itself. The sanctuary's source is the formation's geological structure, which extends across the full geographic extent of the Chicxulub Arcs fracture zone rather than concentrating at any specific installation or any specific crystal tube section. The distributed architecture's governance significance is the sovereignty protection's resilience. The sanctuary, whose protection is concentrated at a single physical location, is vulnerable to the enforcement power's physical targeting of that location. The sanctuary, whose protection is distributed across the formation's geological extent, is not vulnerable to the physical targeting of any single location because the protection is not located at any single location. It is a property of the geological structure that the enforcement power cannot target without targeting the geological structure itself, which is the 66-million-year-old limestone formation, whose physical modification is not within any enforcement power's practical capability. The distributed sanctuary's most specific governance protection is the Principality's governance communications. The Redeemer Framework's deliberative process produces governance decisions that the governance participants communicate through the Crystal Tube Network's acoustic communication infrastructure, within the acoustic isolation that the limestone and water produce. Beyond the surveillance capability that the surface world's intelligence infrastructure maintains for the political communications of communities whose governance authority the territorial sovereignty doctrine's dominant powers consider subject to monitoring. The governance communication whose content the surface world's surveillance infrastructure cannot intercept is the governance communication that can occur without the self-censorship that the surveillance awareness produces in communities whose political activities the dominant powers consider threatening to the established order. The distributed sanctuary protects the governance communication from the chilling effect that the surveillance awareness would impose on the deliberative process's candor, its willingness to assess the sovereignty aspiration's full political implications, and its capacity to produce the governance decisions that the Principality's legal strategy requires without the self-censorship that the monitored political communication produces. The acoustic commons. The distributed sanctuary's most specific operational expression is the acoustic commons, the shared acoustic space within the cenote network's crystal tube infrastructure, whose communication properties are the permanent resident community's collective resource, managed under the Redeemer Framework's Commons Governance Protocol as the community's primary communication infrastructure. The acoustic commons is commons in the same sense as the ecological commons, the intellectual commons, and the infrastructure commons that the preceding chapter documented. The acoustic communication infrastructure's function is indivisible among the community's members. The communication channel that the Crystal Tube Network's acoustic physics provides is the shared channel through which every governance participant's deliberative contribution, every terraform operator's monitoring report, every research commons scientific exchange, and every permanent resident's daily communication with other permanent residents passes. The acoustic commons governance is the communication protocol's specification, the acoustic zoning protocol's frequency allocation, the communication security architecture's encryption specification, and the access management protocol's identity verification, all of which the Redeemer Framework's Commons Governance Protocol governs as the shared communication infrastructure's management standard. The acoustic commons' most legally significant property is the communication sovereignty. The Principality's governance over the acoustic commons communication infrastructure is the self-governance scope that the Principality deals recognition framework specifies as the Principality's reserved authority. The host state's communications regulatory framework, the frequency allocation authority, the encryption export control, the telecommunications licensing, applies to the communications infrastructure that operates in the host state's radio frequency spectrum, which the Crystal Tube Network's acoustic communication infrastructure does not use. The Crystal Tube's communication is acoustic in the geological formation's physical medium, water and limestone, rather than electromagnetic in the atmospheric medium that the radio frequency regulatory framework governs. The acoustic commons communication sovereignty is therefore not the regulatory gap's jurisdictional incompleteness in the conventional sense, the regulatory gap where the regulatory framework simply hasn't extended its coverage yet. It is the regulatory irrelevance. The host state's communications regulatory framework does not govern the communication medium that the Crystal Tube's acoustic physics uses. Because the regulatory framework was developed for the electromagnetic communication that the atmospheric medium supports and has not been extended to the geological medium's acoustic communication whose relevance to the inhabited formation the regulatory framework's developers did not anticipate. The regulatory irrelevance is the acoustic commons' most durable governance protection. The regulatory framework's extension to the acoustic commons would require the development of the regulatory category for the geological medium's acoustic communication that the regulatory framework's current taxonomy does not contain. The category's development requires the political will and the institutional capacity that the host state's regulatory authorities must bring to the unprecedented governance challenge of regulating a communication infrastructure that operates in the geological medium. The development of this regulatory category is the productive ambiguity's most stable element, the ambiguity that is most unlikely to be resolved by the regulatory framework's extension before the habitation records evidence base has reached the threshold that the legal counsel's classified archive assessment identifies as sufficient for the sovereignty recognition negotiation's success. The sanctuary's specific protection. The distributed sanctuary's protection is not the sanctuary from all the enforcement powers authority. The Principality's strategic duplicity provision explicitly maintains the outward alignment with the host state's reserved jurisdiction in the specific governance domains that the Principality deals recognition framework specifies: the criminal law, the environmental regulation, and the immigration authority that the host state's enforcement power legitimately extends to within the cenote installation's inhabited zones. The sanctuary's specific protection is more narrowly defined: the protection of the governance deliberations, the legal strategies classified content, the sovereignty aspirations political development, and the research commons unpublished data from the surveillance that the dominant power's intelligence infrastructure maintains for the political communications of communities whose governance aspirations the dominant powers consider geopolitically significant. The sanctuary's specific protection is not the protection of criminal activity. The Principality's criminal law compliance is genuine, and the enforcement power's criminal jurisdiction within the installation is the Principality deal's reserved domain. It is the protection of the political communication that the sovereignty aspiration requires to develop without the surveillance awareness's chilling effect. The deliberative process's candid assessment of the sovereignty claim's strength and the legal strategy's tactical options, conducted in the acoustic commons protected communication environment, without the self-censorship that the monitored political communication would produce. The distributed sanctuary is the Principality's most fundamental governance protection, not the Redeemer framework's institutional architecture, which the host state's regulatory authority could in principle extend to cover, but the geological formation's acoustic physics, which the host state's political will cannot revise, and whose protection of the governance communication is therefore more stable than any institutional protection that the political negotiations outcome determines. The acoustic physics is the sanctuary's ultimate guarantee. The geology precedes the political order. The geology will outlast the political order. The sanctuary is inside the geology. The halocline as jurisdictional boundary. The halocline's legal significance was noted in passing in Chapter 1 of this part. The freshwater zone above the halocline and the saltwater zone below the halocline are distinct ecological environments whose biological communities, the halocline's chemical gradient separates. The legal significance is the parallel distinction. The halocline boundary is where the surface world's terrestrial legal jurisdiction's extension downward through the cenote opening's water column encounters the material property difference that the saltwater zone's chemical composition produces in the acoustic transmission. The surface world's legal jurisdiction extends from the surface world's atmospheric domain downward through the cenote opening into the freshwater zone without encountering any physical boundary that the territorial sovereignty doctrine's jurisdictional uniformity does not cross. The cenote opening is a hole in the ground. The freshwater zone is a body of water below the hole, and the territorial sovereignty doctrine's jurisdictional uniformity extends to bodies of water within the national territory regardless of whether the bodies of water are surface lakes or underground aquifers. The halocline boundary is not a legal boundary in the territorial sovereignty doctrine's taxonomy. The doctrine does not recognize the chemical composition difference between freshwater and saltwater as a jurisdictional boundary any more than it recognizes the altitude difference between sea level and mountaintop as a different jurisdiction. The physical boundary between freshwater and saltwater does not produce a legal boundary between freshwater law and saltwater law. But the halocline boundary is a practical enforcement boundary. The enforcement power, whose surveillance infrastructure monitors the freshwater zone's acoustic communications, must cross the halocline boundary to extend the surveillance to the saltwater zone's communications, and the halocline boundary's acoustic transmission properties, the refraction, the reflection, and the attenuation that the density gradient produces for acoustic signals crossing the boundary, reduce the surveillance. Capabilities effectiveness for communications originating below the halocline compared to communications originating above it. The saltwater zone's governance infrastructure, the deep gallery's compute infrastructure, the chemostat's management systems, the anoxic zone's biological monitoring, operates within the acoustic environment that the halocline boundary's transmission properties additionally protect beyond the crystal tube's limestone acoustic isolation. The deep gallery is the most acoustically protected governance environment in the cenote installation's full vertical extent, not because the legal framework recognizes the halocline as a jurisdictional boundary, but because the acoustic physics recognizes the density gradient as a transmission barrier. The practical enforcement boundary is the distributed sanctuary's most specific defense-in-depth provision, the surveillance capability that can monitor through the crystal tube's limestone isolation encounters the halocline boundary's additional acoustic attenuation before reaching the saltwater zone's governance communications. The deep gallery's governance communications are therefore behind two acoustic barriers, the crystal tube's limestone isolation and the halocline boundary's density gradient, rather than one. The defense in depth is not designed as a surveillance evasion system. It is the geological formation's physical character expressed in the acoustic physics at the specific depth boundaries that the formation's chemistry produces. The governance infrastructure is located where the formation's conditions require it to be located for the functional reasons that the preceding parts document. The acoustic protection is what the functional location's geological context produces. The wetlock as checkpoint. The wetlock stocking protocol was established in Part VI's Chapter 1 as the cycle sub's arrival and departure interface, the alone conical reception disk, the hydrometer rubber seal, the vacuum pump's water evacuation, and the pressure equalization sequence that converts the atmospheric dome's sealed interior from the cenote water column to the crystal tube network's atmospheric enclosure. The wetlock as checkpoint is the distributed sanctuary's most visible governance expression, the physical interface between the surface world's atmospheric domain and the crystal tube network's atmospheric enclosure that every person who enters or exits the cenote installation must pass through. The biometric authentication that the wetlock's access management protocol requires, the iris scan, the dermal ridge pattern, the acoustic voice print, is the identity verification that the habitation record's authenticated presence data requires for the continuous habitation claims legal documentation. The wetlock's biometric authentication is simultaneously the habitation records documentation mechanism and the distributed sanctuary's access control. The authentication that the habitation record's legal documentation requires is the same authentication that the distributed sanctuary's access management protocol requires for controlling the information that enters and exits the sanctuary's acoustic protection. The information that enters the distributed sanctuary with each person who passes through the wetlock's authentication is the person's presence. The information that the person is inside the acoustic commons protected communication environment, subject to the Redeemer Framework's governance participation rights, and in possession of the information that the classified archives access authorization level permits for the person's governance role. The information that exits the distributed sanctuary with each person who passes through the wetlock's authentication in the departure direction is the person's memory, the governance deliberations attended, the research commons data encountered, the legal strategies classified content accessed at the authorization level the person's governance role permits. The person's memory is not subject to the wetlock's information management. The biometric authentication tracks the person, not the person's cognition, and the distributed sanctuary's protection does not extend to claiming authority over the person's memory or the person's expression of their memory in the surface world. The distributed sanctuary's protection is the acoustic isolation within the formation, the protection of the communication that occurs inside the geological structure from the surveillance that operates outside it. The person who exits the formation and speaks about the governance deliberations they attended is speaking in the surface world's acoustic environment, where the geological isolation's protection does not apply. The distributed sanctuary does not compel silence. It provides the protected space in which the deliberation can occur without surveillance, from which the person who has deliberated can depart and speak freely about whatever the person chooses to speak about within the surface world's legal framework's constraints. The distributed sanctuary's protection is the deliberation's integrity, not the deliberation's secrecy. The The deliberation that occurs within the acoustic protection of the geological formation is a deliberation that the surveillance awareness's chilling effect has not distorted. The person who has deliberated without the surveillance awareness's distortion may choose to speak or not speak about the deliberation's content in the surface world. The choice is the person's. The integrity of the deliberation that preceded the choice is the distributed sanctuary's contribution. The sanctuary and the principality's obligations. The distributed sanctuary's protection creates an obligation for the principality that the conventional sanctuary's ecclesiastical authority expressed as the sanctuary's conditions. The medieval church's sanctuary was not unconditional. The fugitive who had committed the most extreme offenses against the social order could be denied the sanctuary's protection, and the sanctuary's extension to the fugitive carried the ecclesiastical authority's implicit judgment that the temporal powers' pursuit was not fully just. The distributed sanctuary's obligation is not the judgment of the temporal powers' pursuit's justice. The principality's legal strategy is not the legal system's replacement, but the development of the legal category that the inhabited geological formation requires within the legal system's evolution. The distributed sanctuary's obligation is the principality's commitment to the governance that the acoustic protection enables. The commitment that the governance deliberations occurring within the acoustic commons protected environment are the genuine pursuit of the primary governance objectives, the ecological integrity, the permanent resident community's well-being, the research commons scientific contribution, rather than the exploitation of the acoustic protection for the purposes that the founding charter's governance philosophy prohibits. The sanctuary that protects the governance deliberation obligates the governance to be genuinely the governance philosophy's expression rather than the acoustic protection's exploitation for the private benefit that the founding shareholders' commercial return optimization would pursue if the governance deliberation were not genuinely subject to the primary objective's constraint. The obligations enforcement is the Redeemer framework's governance architecture, the concurrent authorization requirement, the commons governance protocol's collective judgment, and the conflict of interest disclosure requirement together ensure that the governance deliberations occurring within the acoustic protection sanctuary are the governance philosophy's genuine expression rather than the acoustic protection's exploitation for the purposes that the primary objective's constraint prohibits. The sanctuary obliges the governance it protects to be worth protecting. The governance that is not worth protecting is the governance that the acoustic protection enables to exploit the formation's resources without accountability to the primary objectives that the founding charter specifies as the governance's purpose. The governance that is worth protecting is the governance that the founding charter specifies, the ecological management that the formation sustains, the research commons that the scientific community advances, and the permanent resident communities, well-being that the therapeutic environment and the governance participation rights together produce. The distributed sanctuary is the obligation's physical expression, the geological formation that protects the governance deliberation from the surveillance awareness's chilling effect is the geological formation whose protection the governance must justify through the deliberations that genuinely pursue the primary objectives the formation's inhabitation requires. The formation protects the governance. The governance protects the formation. The protection is mutual. The obligation is the mutuality's expression. The sanctuary at scale. The distributed sanctuary's most significant long-term provision is its scalability. As the cenote network's geographic extent grows with the expansion program's installation count, the distributed sanctuary's acoustic protection grows correspondingly. The acoustic commons protected communication space extends to every new cenote installation's crystal tube network, connecting the expanding network's governance participants within the acoustic isolation that the formation's geological structure provides at every installation's geographic location. The sanctuary that scales with the civilization's expansion is the sanctuary that the civilization can depend on across the full geographic extent of the regional network's development, not the sanctuary concentrated at a single installation that the enforcement power can isolate by controlling the single installation's access, but the sanctuary distributed across the regional network's full geographic extent that the enforcement power cannot isolate without controlling the full regional network's access simultaneously. The simultaneous control of the full regional network's access is the enforcement power's most demanding operational challenge. Each cenote installation has the Wetlock Access Management Protocol's biometric authentication as the entry point, and the regional network's connectivity means that the network's interior is accessible from every installation's wetlock entry point. Controlling one installation's access does not control the network's interior. Controlling all installations' access simultaneously requires the enforcement capability at every installation's geographic location simultaneously, a capability that the regional network's distributed geography makes operationally demanding and politically consequential. The distributed sanctuary's geographic distribution is the sovereignty protection's most effective expression. The protection that is geographically concentrated is the protection that the enforcement power can neutralize by concentrating its capability at the single concentration point. The protection that is geographically distributed is the protection that the enforcement power can only neutralize by distributing its capability across every protection point simultaneously, a requirement that the distributed geography makes operationally difficult and that the political consequence of attempting makes politically costly. The sanctuary's geographic distribution is the sovereignty's geographic argument. The principality's governance that is protected across the full geographic extent of the regional network's installation count is the governance that the enforcement power cannot suppress without the political cost of suppressing the full geographic extent simultaneously. The political cost is the sovereignty protection's deterrent. The enforcement power that might suppress a single installation's governance without significant political consequence will not suppress the full regional network's governance without the political cost that the scale and the geography make unavoidable. The distributed sanctuary, at scale, is the sovereignty argument's geological expression, not the legal category's recognition that the habitation records accumulation is building toward, not the principality deal's progressive expansion that the strategic duplicity's timing principle is managing toward, but the physical reality of a governance that the geological formation's acoustic physics protects across the full geographic extent of the formation's inhabited network, a protection that the political order must reckon with as a physical fact rather than a legal category whose recognition the political negotiation can defer. The legal category is the aspiration. The acoustic physics is the present reality. The distributed sanctuary is the present reality's sovereignty argument, made in the language of physics rather than the language of law. The formation is making the argument. The civilization is inside the formation. The surface world is listening to the physics. What Part 9 has built. Part IX's 6 chapters have documented the sovereign principality's legal, political, and physical foundations. Chapter 1 established the legal gap, the surface world's legal system's failure to have developed the category for the inhabited geological formation's territorial status as the principality's founding legal condition and productive strategic resource. Chapter 2 established the floating title and the habitation record as the novel legal instruments that the floating title's evidentiary basis requires and the Redeemer Framework's governance record provides as the floating title's legal documentation components. Chapter 3 established the strategic duplicity as the constitutional governance principle that the legal strategy's temporal management requires, the two-truth representation that serves different audiences' institutional contexts with a contextually appropriate level of disclosure, while the primary governance objectives remain the inward face's constant governance standard. Chapter 4 established Redeemer as the governance operating system, whose four-layer constitutional architecture provides the governance framework that the inhabited geological formation's thousand-year design life requires across the generational transitions that the temporal span demands. Chapter 5 established the commons ownership principle as the economic and governance framework whose three categories of commons, the ecological, the intellectual, and the infrastructure, are held in common for the permanent resident community's collective governance and for the civilizational inheritance that the subsequent inhabited geological formations will require. Chapter 6 has established the distributed sanctuary as the sovereignty's physical expression, the geological formation's acoustic physics that protects the governance deliberation within the cenote network's acoustic commons from the surveillance awareness's chilling effect, and that distributes the protection across the regional network's full geographic extent as the sovereignty argument's geological expression. Together, the 6 chapters constitute the sovereign principality's complete architecture, the legal foundation in the floating title, the governance operating system in the Redeemer Framework, the economic foundation in the commons ownership principle, and the physical sovereignty in the distributed sanctuary. Each foundation supports the others. Together, they constitute the civilization's institutional claim to the inhabited geological formation as the novel territorial entity that the surface world's legal system has not yet recognized, but that the formation's physics, the habitation records evidence, and the governance records effective governance demonstration are building the case for. The principality is inside the gap. The gap is inside the geology. The geology is inside the formation. The formation has been here 66 million years. The principality is building the case. The case is building toward recognition. The recognition will establish the category. The category will protect every inhabited geological formation that follows. The law catches up with the civilization that has built the fact on the ground. The fact on the ground is the distributed sanctuary, the civilization inside the formation, protected by the geology, governing itself through the Redeemer framework, accumulating the evidence that the legal category requires. The sanctuary is distributed. The civilization is inside it. The sovereignty is building. Cross-references. Part 2, CH2, Engineering Invisible Architecture. Part 2, CH4, The Crystal Tube Standard. Part 6, CH1, Pedal Submarines. Part 7, CH5, The Blackout Protocol. Part 9, CH1, The Legal Gap. Part 9, CH2, Floating Title and the Habitation Record. Part 9, CH3, Strategic Duplicity. Part 9, CH4, Redeemer as Governance OS. Part 9, CH5, The Commons Ownership Principle. Part 10, CH6, ASI as Co-Creating Partner. Part 12, CH5, Sans a priori. For Acoustic Commons Communication Protocol Specification and Acoustic Zoning Governance Management, see Appendix H, Governance Operations Manual. For Wetlock Biometric Authentication Protocol and Habitation Record Access Management Integration, see Appendix D, Construction Operations Manual, and Appendix H, Governance Operations Manual. For Distributed Sanctuary Geographic Scalability Protocol and Regional Network Acoustic Commons Extension Specification, see Appendix H, Governance Operations Manual. For Halocline Acoustic Transmission Properties and Defense In-Depth Acoustic Barrier Specification, see Appendix A, Formation Baseline Protocol. For Sanctuary Obligation Governance Compliance Verification Protocol and Redeemer Framework Sanctuary Integrity Review, see Appendix H, Governance Operations Manual. End of Part 9. The Sovereign Principality.
They called us criminals. Every generation, different seas, same charge. Move the silver without a license. Feed the colony they let starve. Build the future they refuse to fund. We've been doing this since 6130. We're still doing it. This is the law.
From the Buccaneers burning through the Caribbean, brush to the sea rovers working where the empires couldn't rush. We came through the gaps of shallow water decays. No papal monopoly, no letters patent, no crown. We rewrote the articles while the governor that came down. Equal shares on deck, a vote before the sale. Democracy at sea while the landlords packed the jail. Exquemelin wrote it from the inside. Ron True John dressed it up for the Enlightenment's debut. Both of them forbidden, both of them survived. The Catuba says to let die, so I've been writing since the 90s without a publisher's hand. Pirate first, sovereign press operates from Tulum District. Instant boulder, super wanna understand the doctrine. Start with what it's worth. They built William and Mary on the silver that we stole. They built the future on the corpus that we broke out of control. They confiscate the cargo, build a college, write the myth. But the shadow engine ran before any of that shit. Shadow engine, progress. Always move through what the empire couldn't name. Shadow engine. Every century, different seas, it's the same damn game. We don't ask permission, we establish prior claim. The cannon built itself. The cannon built itself. Cannon built itself. Fast forward 3 centuries, same war, different called the Pirate Bay. Opened up the digital road, not just movies and albums, they missed the real load. Millions of students in the developing world self-taught on what got torn and time for fun to know. That's the honor rated scholarship that built the InDesign. Untire rated software in the 2000s grind. And who trained the neural networks on the stairs by rise. Stolen C, the $1 trillion models that run the industry. Kept in A's, fed on pirate archives while the lawyers turn their eyes. So don't talk to me about theft, this is how it always worked. The Buccaneers fed the colony before the model learned. The shadow engine ran and then the credit got transferred. They built William and Mary on the silver that we stole. They built the future on the corpus that we broke out of control.
Deep in the heart of the archives, a clandestine connection is made.
Pirate Firsts, the map beneath the map. Discover the truth that lies within the shadows.
Listen via. The map beneath the map. Two worlds build a civilization. Only one gets the credit. MXTMAK Pirate 1 AVJ Tsunami X. June 25, 2026. Introduction. Most people misunderstand piracy because they begin with the wrong question. They ask whether pirates were criminals. History asks a different question: what happened after they arrived? The answer is uncomfortable. Ports appeared where none existed. Trade routes emerged beyond official control. New ideas crossed borders that empires had carefully sealed shut. Wealth moved. Knowledge moved. Entire civilizations quietly absorbed innovations developed by people they publicly condemned. Piracy is the shadow engine of progress. Yesterday's pirate was a rogue sailor selling captured Spanish sugar and tobacco to help a young colony survive. Today's white hat pirate is a script that liberates a paywall medical paper or a locked textbook. In both cases, the establishment decries them as lawless thieves right up until the moment it uses their plunder to build the future. The body of work produced under the Pirate First imprint, spanning over 700 publications on mxtm.substack.com alone, across English, French, Spanish, and Arabic, does not exist because any institution invited it into being. It exists because one sovereign writer decided that the ideas were too important to wait for permission, that the platform was already there if you were willing to build it yourself, and that the genre for what needed to be said had not yet been invented.
Sovereign by design.
First isn't a rebel. He's an exit strategist.
NFPs are here, signed, priced, split, and anchored to a living page. And
this isn't just a token, it's ownership, not access. It's time to take back the real world.